Good afternoon, folks. How are you? Try it again. Good afternoon, everybody. Awesome. I just want to welcome you all to our joint Town Council Planning Commission workshop today. The subject matter is going to be stormwater management, and we thank all of you for joining us today. I do want to thank our participated guests initially for their ability to provide their expertise and their experiences as we go down this road. Today's a learning opportunity, an extension of a lot of conversation that has been had amongst our town officials, our town staff, community members, and the like. And so to our commissioners and to our town council members, we hope that we have the right heads in the room that give you a little bit more comfortability as we go down a path of exploring options of what our community Kiowa should be able to consider and allowing us to become a little bit more resilient. Just a few housekeeping notes. I won't be up here long, but I'll come back down and help kind of steer conversation and keep us kind of guided on time for today. For those visiting guests, if you haven't had a chance to sign in before you leave, please do sign in just outside on the way out if you haven't signed in already. Before we get going on the actual agenda, I will allow our Planning Commission Chairman, Mr. Bill Dowdy, and our Mayor, Brad Belt, to just offer some opening sort of remarks to the community, and then we'll go from there, and I'll chime into our speakers. But thank you all. We'll get started.
Well, thank you for all being here. Like Sean says, this is an important topic. It's been discussed and kicked around a little bit in the Planning Commission, I know, as well as the town. So it's really a major stepping stone to get everyone here and all the interest that we have from our residents. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, John, and staff, for putting together these materials. Just to elaborate a little bit on what John said in terms of providing some context around this. It's labeled as a stormwater management exercise, but it's really broader than that, or part of a broader discussion about resiliency issues on the island more generally. Obviously, we're informed by what happened last summer with Idalia, as well as the nor'easter that came through in December, and the flooding impacts that we had there. Obviously, some heavy rainstorms. We, fortunately here on Kiowa Island, got away relatively unscathed by Helene, but unfortunately some of our state neighbors and those in neighboring states did not, very tragically. But we now can recognize the power of water, and we've got to plan accordingly. The catalyst for this was work the Planning Commission was doing with regard to potential ordinance recommendations regarding impervious surfaces. Or pervious surfaces, and that had grown out a little bit out of a planning department review of a number of recent development-related projects, and a report that was provided to the town by one of our engineering consultants, Weston and Sampson, that suggested that our standards were perhaps not as rigorous as in other jurisdictions. And then you start connecting the dots with extraordinary work that the Marsh Management Committee has been doing and the Environmental Committee under the leadership of Councilmember Kay, and what the Planning Commission has been doing in terms of the comprehensive plan. And so we thought this was an opportunity to actually get everybody on the same page, trying to get the same kind of informational and data inputs, be guided by science, be guided by data, and what we may do with regard to ordinances related to impervious or pervious surfaces, that's really kind of only the starting point of the discussion. There's more that needs to be looked at in order to ensure that our island is resilient as it can be. But thank you, John, again, for yours and the team's preparation for our guest who will provide us with relevant information, and to all of you for attending.
Awesome. So there's just one slide I wanted to share before we get started, and then I'll allow our guests to the end. believe it or not, this conversation of where we are today, as the mayor mentioned, there's a number of things that have been in the works amongst the community. And I think one of the things I want everyone in this room to realize is nothing will be done overnight regarding this subject matter. And we've done, when I say we, that's not just the town, but community association, others, Conservancy a lot. And it started really a similar event in 2015 that I think what I have called it was an eye-opener to the community. If you all recall the 1,000-year flood event, and after that, that's when our flood mitigation and sea level rise committee was formed. And from that flood mitigation and sea level rise, which was a subcommittee of our environmental committee, they prepared almost over 130 recommendations that the community should consider. And so since that time period, entities have been making progress towards some of those recommendations. The principal one from a planning standpoint was us looking at resiliency matters as it pertains to the comprehensive plan, and that birthed our comprehensive marsh management plan. And so to date, a number of things that you've seen relatively to the conversation around resiliency has been focused around the marsh, as that being one of the most identified risks in terms of our natural resources. But all of the planning initiatives that have been birthed from that marsh management plan, I think we're at a stage right now where we can commit to say, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to continue down a path that will lead us down success when it comes to resiliency. So at the end of today, one of the things I want to do is be able to set up just understanding what the next steps might be after this conversation. And so today we have Chris Wanamaker, who is representing Charleston County. I'll let Chris introduce himself if you want to share anything else. And then following Chris will be Ryan and Matt from the Key Island Community Association. And those gentlemen will share what Community Association has been done as far as infrastructure. As you know, that they manage principally all of the infrastructure for Kiowa. So let me stop talking because I know you guys want to dive in. I know you don't. So I'm just saying.
Just to do the general overview.
Yeah.
Today's. Okay, so.
Do you need them, Neil, to turn the mics on here or?
If you want, I might do better standing up anyway. Just been asked to do a general overview of water quantity, quality, kind of today's standards of what we see in Charleston County. We do anywhere from small residential. I don't know if I should start at a higher level here. I apologize. That's why I didn't want to give a presentation. I don't know a lot about Kiowa, so take that with everything I'm about to say, or where y'all are at with stormwater management or master planning. So again, just a general overview of the stormwater world today is, for us, it's not DHEC run. We have a team of 14 people. 8 of those are inspectors, other engineers, and various levels of plan reviewers. Ranges all the way from a single-family home, which can wreak havoc just as easily as a very large development. Believe it or not, that's why we took the decision to permit those, even though DHEC did not require us to do so back in 2007 with a heavy heart, because we knew of a lot of rural areas that if you put in one driveway and it cuts off an entire wetlands branch just to build one tiny home on 100 acres, it could still wreak damage to the surrounding community. So fast forward roughly 18 years, I question that decision some days, and we've started to take some measures of how to reduce our literal paperwork more so than actual, where it's not benefiting just to do paperwork, right? So a 500 lot subdivision, we still permit 501 permits for that one subdivision, the master and then each individual lot. Save you the details as to why, it just is what it is. We are still going to look at so we range from everywhere from those single family mom and pop homes out in the middle of the Edisto and McCullenville areas, all the way to the, right now, 400 lot subdivisions on Kiowa River. With that comes a lot of regulations that have morphed over the years, from DHEC's boilerplate 61-9, 72-300, stormwater regulations up to the 10-year storm pre and post. Everybody thinks about how much damage it's going to cause. And you hear people talk about you only design up to the 10-year, and you'll hear Charleston County say we design up to the 25-year. It's still a little blurred as to what that means, but it is a pre and post hard line. And I want to bring this all back to a barrier island scenario here, and I will. But we also look at the 100-year. So I think you could even argue to maybe look at the 500-year, irregardless. What I'm really trying to get at here is for the other 3 barrier islands that Charleston County manages, Folly, Isle of Palms, and Sullivan's, they are bound to follow our manual, which has to be equal for 6 other entities, unincorporated, and then 2 other municipalities. So it's very difficult to write specific ordinances because each barrier island is like their own unique island, and they bring with them their own unique challenges. And so the role that I've played before is just trying to give technical guidance, and those ordinances being put into the zoning regs, which even Charleston County has started to do for our max impervious area, is in our zoning regs. It is not in our Charleston County Stormwater Manual. The biggest challenges we face with barrier islands, aside from flooding, and I'm talking about just from an MS4 perspective here, of course it's flooding. Every high tide, there's flooding. Every king tide, there's even more flooding. Every hurricane, right? There's a level of acceptance that barrier islands have kind of come to live with, and surprisingly, the amount of complaints that come out of them is significantly less, whereas other areas of unincorporated Charleston County who've not seen that can cry a whole lot louder. Yeah.
You mentioned MS4. Could you expound on that? That's MS4.
Yeah, sure. So the MS4 is the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. It's the delegated portion from EPA down to the states. We are a delegated state. DHEC, now known as DES, said, well, we've got 74 municipalities that are over the threshold. We can't possibly do the workload. Let's delegate it out. So they delegated it out to 74 other entities. Charleston County was one of them. What that brings with it is 6 minimum control measures. We're all small MS4s. I'll try and boil all this down to, education outreach, post-construction, review of the plans, inspection of those plans, and then good housekeeping. If you want more detail, let me know, but good housekeeping is basically state and federal governments realize, what probably is the biggest businesses out there? It's not a Boeing or a corporation, it's actually government entities, our facilities. We have billions of dollars, so let's actually make us police our own. So that's good housekeeping. Am I answering your question, John?
John, it might be useful to have, provide a little more clarity about what the issue is for the town, since we are not MS4.
Well, just the parameters per se around the qualifications to obtain becoming an MS4 and why Kiowa we wouldn't be able to qualify, but if you can touch on specifically, if not.
I believe it's 5,000 population and if you're within the urbanized growth boundary as determined by the census data every 10 years, or if you have impaired stations. However, it's ultimately DHEC's decision and y'all's. They would approach y'all and say, hey, what do you really want? Do you really need this? Is there benefit in it for both parties? And ultimately, y'all could reach a decision on that. I would think they're not trying to cram MS4s down anyone's throat, especially I'm not going to speak for them. You want a scenario of Hollywood and Ravenel?
Hollywood and Ravenel, they manage their own sewer systems.
Their own sewer systems, correct.
The town of Kiowa does not.
Okay.
We essentially have 2 main arteries of roads, but none of the infrastructure regarding stormwater management, ponds, and those types of utilities, those are managed by the community association. So it's a private entity versus a public entity. That's what I kind of thought you would expound. But I think giving an example of some adjacent communities might help paint that picture, like Hollywood or Ravenel.
So it's not based on your sewer, who owns it or not? It's not.
On the capacity wise.
On the number of customers you have?
Correct.
It's not based on that either. MS4 designation?
Yes.
So it wouldn't be based on that either. It's all about your population. Yeah.
Why does MS4 matter? Why is it an issue for Kiowa Island, if at all?
Being able to deliver those services.
Right, so there would be forced requirements that DHEC would give you to meet. And so that's the, help me out, Wes. There's so many aspects here that I've got to bring together, and I know I'm not going to be able to get to them all, which makes me nervous to explain any
Well, we're
one.
just talking stormwater though, so if you could just
Okay.
focus on the stormwater part.
So let's separate out sewer. There's even the stormwater flooding aspect, your ponds and your pond maintenance. Even throw another boat in here that says MS4 compliance. You're talking regulatory, you're talking standards, but you're also talking about the town having a responsibility to check boxes in some instances. Fix the pollution would be one of them. It's not as simple, I don't know which side you're thinking they would do, but DHEC's basically going to say, this is your responsibility, we'll come audit you every 5 to 15 years and make sure you're doing your job. Whereas right now, what jobs do they do for you, other than plan review?
You're going to hear later on that it's not even a stormwater problem from a town standpoint. Stormwater is managed by KICA, the Homeowners Administration, POA.
Okay?
The stormwaters you'll hear about effectively dealt with over the years. As far as the sewage, it's a third party maintaining the sewage problem. So I don't know where it fits at all. From what you've said, how does it fit at all?
The stormwater ponds would not come under the stormwater. So let's address maybe the sewer first. The sewer would have nothing to do with the MS4, other than if it is a, other than if there was, say, a sanitary sewer overflow that was not a reportable quantity, and the MS4s need to know about it because we're taking samples downstream and it pops hot. And we need to know it's from that source, not somebody dumping a honey truck somewhere or somebody that's illegally pumping something. It's for information, for enforcement. In sewer, we do not have enforcement over.
You don't have any over stormwater in respect to the POA either, do you?
In a privately owned sewer situation,
Stormwater facility.
we would have enforcement over things such as people dumping things into the stream, the creeks. We would have enforcement abilities to protect those waterways, private or public. We would not have maintenance responsibilities for those.
So go ahead, we'll let you finish, but
No.
the question is, where does the stormwater come from? And most of it is off a river, which is not part of the town.
Say that again.
Yeah, explain, so tell me what you're,
What?
Say that one more time.
Most of the excess stormwater, it's not managed by the POA effectively.
Okay.
Comes from the river or a surge of different storms, which is not part of the town.
so when you think of MS4, think of protecting the whole community, the whole environment, the stormwater conveyance systems.
Where does, you pointed out the source of basically the regulatory requirement. And where does that cover Kiewit? It doesn't sound like it covers it.
Correct. Kiowa is not
It
in
does
there.
not. So
Okay.
let me ask a sort of a different question here. If you can discuss or just share, what does Charleston County do as far as enforcing stormwater regulations in the stormwater manual? Let's shift the conversation and kind of discuss the county's
There you go.
model, if you will.
Okay, good.
New. I think that's what we need to talk about is new stuff, not existing. Good point.
So back real quick, it's for new development. This does not go backwards to 1950s development, is what MS4s take. Everything from 2007 and on is Charleston County's purview that we permitted. That's another piece in here that is to be considered. But as far as enforcement for stormwater stuff, it's usually, it can range anywhere from people dumping loads of dirt right next to a channel or canal that we typically maintain, is where we find them the most, all the way to people discharging their swimming pools. It's got to be dechlorinated. Chlorination depletes oxygen in the receiving stream, so it kills everything out. Paint.
Still doesn't tell you how the authority vested in you comes to the island.
It doesn't. Right now, we have no,
Including new development.
including new development, anything within the town of
Not there at
Kiowa.
all. There's no responsibility of the town for you to, in any way,
Correct,
get involved in the management of town.
correct. Yes, sir.
So, John, maybe back up a little bit. Charleston County has adopted a regulatory regime for stormwater management that, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is more rigorous than kind of the baseline or boilerplate formerly DHEC, DES stormwater management standards. Is that correct? And is it also correct that heretofore, Kiowa Island has only utilized the DHEC, DES standards? And so one thing would be helpful to understand is what is involved in that greater rigor in the Charleston County stormwater management regulatory both process and substance than what we have currently, which is just reliance on DHEC standards.
Yeah, I would like to know what Charleston County, real general high picture, what does Charleston County do with respect to stormwater management? And then I'd like to compare that to what we, Kiowa, currently do. And do we need to adjust or change or take ideas from you? I mean, that's where I'm trying, that's what I would like to take away from all of this.
So we take ideas from all over. We've got a folder with 30 other municipalities that do it better than us. Trust me, I don't claim to do everything perfectly. Education and outreach, I would say, is what we do outside of new development now. So trying to cut off my thought patterns that don't apply here. New development standards, we have volume controls, cutting rates. I don't know how to detechnicalize this, but it's just cutting rates in half, controlling volume, looking at downstream analysis, and the 25-year pre to post rate, or I could boil it down to that. Aside from that.
All of that is not in the DHEC standard.
Correct, yes, sir. Aside from new development standards and thinking of the older infrastructure that's been around forever before any permits were done, I would say education and outreach is our biggest fight, is our biggest hurdle that we try and tackle every single day. Getting into the schools, talking to the business owner that has a pond that nobody has a permit to, doesn't even know what it's supposed to be designed to do. But still, it's a pond, it clearly has an outfall structure, and therefore what should be done. We come from the side of education and outreach, not enforcement. Sanitary sewer overflows are very touchy and tricky. We want to work more with the providers, CWS, North Charleston Sewer, Mount Pleasant. We can't control anything to do with sanitary sewer overflows. However, our conveyances are the results, are what's impacted, right? So trying to understand how we can help them, how can we really can't, but otherwise educating the public after some of those, right? Don't play in the water. Don't go swimming at high, super king high tides, because their fecal coliform count is possibly in the millions, and all the diseases that come from that, right? So the education side of all aspects to do with any type of pollution in our general waterways and conveyances and ditches, we take a role in across every square inch.
That's a great suggestion, and bridging off of that, is the Kiowa River that surrounds the northern side of the island, is that potentially contaminated from a storm event?
Well, not knowing anything about that area you just said, I would just say that
Because I'm going off of people who I see swimming in the Kiowa River or fishing, and, should we not, following a storm event like we just had this past few days?
it really depends on who you ask, and there's a wide range of opinions there. It's from, personally, if you ask my wife, she thinks it's unsafe to, swim anywhere, just because she's scared of a lot of things in the environment that I've probably freaked her out about over the years talking about. But there's the other side that, Andrew Wonderlay with Waterkeepers would say, you shouldn't probably swim 2 weeks after it rains in a heavy rainfall event, because there is a whole lot of stuff that's run off the ground that we've put there that is chemical in nature.
maybe take one specific example to try to figure out where it fits into the regulatory framework. You go over to Kiowa River, the development, particularly around the Dunlin Hotel. You'll see these large areas for concrete washout for construction projects. I've never seen one of those on Kiowa Island. Are they important? And if so, is that something imposed by Charleston County standards, your stormwater management regulations, and why does Kiowa Island not do that?
So what are those, Brad? They're channeling stormwater flow into the river?
No,
What are they?
So if you
Concrete washout.
made it to council's presentation or not, maybe it did. So these would be during construction, being able to manage a construction site where there is a dump of concrete on site, and before that is panned out to some outfall or washed away, there's a control mechanism on site to be able to control sediment runoff, and et cetera. So that's something that's in the stormwater manual as an option for contractors to adhere to.
During construction,
For construction, yeah.
not afterwards.
I mean, it wouldn't need to be afterwards because it'd be
Right,
completed,
that's
but
what I wanted to make sure, so it's
Yeah.
isolated to construction, okay. Now I understand what Brad's talking about.
so, but it's a something that's imposed, it's a regulatory requirement, as I understand it, from Charleston County, that if you have a construction site, a development site, that you provide these concrete washout areas so that you don't have construction debris, water just outflowing into marshes, streams, sewer systems.
Are you talking about a concrete washout in specifically, or are you talking about BMPs in general? Like,
I don't know enough to answer that question.
So I think what they're referring to,
Okay.
when the concrete truck is done dumping its load, the interior of the vessel is cleaned out and they need a place to dump the water, but can't contain it so it doesn't go.
That's exactly right.
Right, so that's a construction thing.
Yes, but what I'm saying is, I believe that is regulated, that's something required for Charleston County, the Charleston County requires, that Kiowa Island has never required.
okay.
That's a fair point.
Is that incorrect, John?
no, so
That's a very good point.
there isn't anything in our, outside of DHEC, outside of DHEC requirements.
Because
there's-
DHEC requirements
So-
don't require that.
So I'm saying, there's not, to enforce that, Kiowa has no enforcement for that.
So we call a concrete washout a construction BMP, best management practice, and that is under the DHEC standards for anything that's tripped their trigger, the permit. And there's concrete trucks coming on site.
The difference is DHEC requirements, if someone's obtaining a permit from DHEC or DES, then the town has no resource to be able to enforce what those BMPs are.
Why can't the town simply adopt those as part of its requirements as well?
That's kind of the process that
Okay.
we started of trying to establish some of those best management practices.
And that's just, concrete washout is just one example of what you would call a BMP. That we're trying to identify where are those things. And part of this exercise is try to identify what has Charleston County done, because Weston Sampson told us was, we're not adhering to best practices. That their view was the DHEC standards, stormwater management standards, did not constitute best practices. And that Charleston County, they pointed to as an example of a jurisdiction that adopted better management practices for stormwater management.
Yeah, in your set of materials that you've seen, and that's sort of what we were building on. Any other jurisdictions that you have had experiences with that might be relevant for conversation for Kiowa?
So the move right now seems to be taken across maybe just the state of South Carolina and certainly other places too, is the concept that basically, and this may not apply to y'all, I apologize if I'm, to capture 95% of the storms is more effective on water quality. Make no mistake about it, the Stormwater MS4 program is here for water quality purposes. It's flood control was a secondary thought. Water quality, it rains, 95% of the time it rains 2 inches of rain or less. in Charleston. What other places are doing is trying to incentivize capturing that 2 inches of rain on multiple parcels. We have ours tied right now to the 40% max impervious area. If you want to go over that, you need to capture 2 inches of rain from that additional area over the 40%.
And how are they capturing it?
Rain gardens, infiltration trenches, cisterns, anything and everything that will hold water. Do we come back and make sure they empty the rain barrel after each rainfall event? I'll save the question. No, we don't. We don't have the manpower. But the concept is what we're trying to just move that needle.
So you built in Charles County regulatory incentive to do that.
And there's a hard line of a requirement at the 40% mark. But yes, if somebody, which we've had a few people come in and say, hey, I want to go ahead and put in the permeable driveway because I might put a mother-in-law suite out back later on. Absolutely. Make sure.
That's a concept that the
That's
planning commission.
that's another concept that we've considered in our initial draft that's been being discussed. Correct. Yeah.
Being an island that I would imagine is probably 90+% residential individual homes, that's y'all's uniqueness. And what would y'all do to play, towards the environmental side? That's what I think about flood control. I mean, y'all have got tide to deal with, which is in my mind, a whole nother topic than water quality and environmental stewardship. So.
Chris, let me ask you a quick question, kind of something that you had said. I just want to make sure I understand. Charleston County, you all are managing for 3 incorporated barrier islands for
Yes, ma'am.
stormwater management for them.
Yes, ma'am.
So when they get applications in, they just submit it to you all, and your standards apply. And that's Folly Beach, IOP. Did you say Sullivan's Island?
Yes, ma'am.
How did that come about? Because don't they have their own, I guess, maybe planning departments, or are the county planning department and you all reviewing it? So if you could just quickly just tell me how
Sure.
how that process came about, where you guys are doing the review for the 3 incorporated barrier islands.
Great question. As communication goes perfectly every time, we can tell you, it is all about communication, emailing, making sure we don't permit something without the planning and zoning department, and making sure that the more stringent ordinance applies, in short.
So within their ordinance, do they specifically state that any stormwater permit approval have to go through Charleston County? So they have adopted essentially you guys' regulations and giving you guys the ability
Yes.
to do all that permitting on their behalf?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Exactly.
thank you.
So, Stephanie, following up on that, so a few years ago, Kiowa Island had its own zoning standards, but essentially contracted out the administration of that to Charleston County. Correct. Until we
got John.
On our zoning department.
Yes.
Are you aware, or somebody aware, so in this instance, these 3 municipalities that have their own zoning and planning departments have contracted out simply a portion of their zoning standards, their
It
building.
sounds like, I don't know if there's a cost, it doesn't sound like only
Nope.
cost, you're collecting the permitting fee, so essentially,
We don't
no, they're keeping the,
We don't even collect a stormwater permit fee. That's their decision to do that. We simply administer the 212-page stormwater manual. I couldn't tell you their planning and zoning regs.
is there an intergovernment agreement
There is, correct.
where so.
And what are the advantages that these 3 barrier islands are seeing from this link up with you guys?
Cost savings,
Expertise.
expertise and cost savings, efficiencies.
That was the issue, Madeline, that came up when the review of the Beachwalker developments and the original discussion about stormwater management concerns of the HOAs, those developments about downstream impacts. And that's when Weston and Sampson, the town retained Weston and Sampson to come in. And there were some questions and concerns about that. But what we kind of learned is the town didn't have the requisite expertise, engineering expertise in-house to be able to, effectively evaluate those kinds of issues. So I guess a much larger team that Charleston County does have that capability.
And to add to that, so what we've been doing, which maybe the reverse, is that we were sending it to DHEC as opposed to Charleston County. But it sounds like the 3 jurisdictions, instead of sending it to DHEC, which is DES now, they use you all, which you all have more stringent regs than DHEC does.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you define in any way, you mentioned storms and runoff, do you define in any way and make a difference between rainwater and a storm surge water or a large storm?
So that's one of the things that, and when Chris is talking about our education outreach, that's one of the things that we really are trying to do a lot of. We don't do anything with storm surge. That's not something that we can't do anything about the storm surge other than, we can do projects to start putting in tidal check valves if you can put them in to hold back that storm surge. But that is not something that our stormwater department or many other stormwater departments can do to separate or to hold back that storm surge. So we really have to get that information out there and let the public know that the stormwater department is not here to hold back that storm surge from your property, from your town, from your business. We're here to control water quality and water quantity from rainfall, not from storm surge events.
So you don't have any requirements regarding tidal surge check valves on pipes?
Correct.
You do not?
We do not.
We're trying to put them in on some projects, and it's taken years in order to get them in.
After Sandy, you might be interested in the fact that New York just spent $113 million to put in barriers specifically to prevent storm surge.
Sure.
So it's being addressed, but the
That's in New
question
York,
is,
not South
you
Carolina.
can't address it with
I get one more question for Chris, and I think this is good, because I think what Kika may have regarding, we're starting to talk a little bit about infrastructure, and I think some of that may be addressed in Kika's presentation, so maybe one more question or so for.
But we're getting back to the mayor's point earlier. He raised a question about the Kiowa River. Most, if not all, and I think you'll hear it later, most, if not all, of the excessive runoff from storms comes from the river as opposed to the ocean. And also, a lot of it presumably is, and you can comment on this better, is caused by overdevelopment or runoff from off the island. It's caused by development on Johns Island, up the river, wherever it goes. It could come out of Waterloo, it could come out of any area where there's runoff. It all comes down to the ocean. So eventually it gets to our river at some point. Is that of any concern from the standpoint of the ordinances you're talking about now?
And I would,
For the county?
and I would say that's probably why we only look at rainfall-based flooding, something that's not tidal, because there's plenty of models out there to show what sea level rise would do in certain situations, but there's currently no regulations to try and defend against sea level rise. The channel that's going down the middle of Johns Island, pick one, Burden Creek, the more and more development that happens on that without regulation, which it's being regulated, but still, the 100-year event, the 500-year event, maybe the 1,000-year event comes again, and then ultimately that much less woods and more impervious area is going to cause even that
Do you
much.
have any information of how much excess runoff flows from that development into the Kiowa River?
I don't, but it might actually be pretty hard to put together, but I mean, we can give you rough numbers if you wanted, but it's still, do you think that are you saying you think there's more stormwater impacts to Kiowa River than there is the ocean? Seems like to me it'd be and I don't know this, it seems like it'd be a drop in the bucket in comparison to the ocean, the amount of volume of water in the ocean, but is that what you're asking is like how much impact?
Up in a bucket on Kiowa, I'll tell you that.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
Who's starting, Matt or Ryan?
Was that John? Excuse me.
Which one of you guys want to start?
I mean, we're going to talk about the same presentation. We'll just kind of both be up there. There's parts that are more technical and engineer-oriented, Ryan will come in. And then there's,
On the
more about the
podium,
water
mine
management,
is red.
which is myself.
Is it supposed to be green? I don't know if they want it green, so if it messed up, but I just noticed it's red.
That one changes.
Okay. I could get mine, but I wasn't sure.
So, Ryan, I think most of you all know Ryan and Matt. What we felt important for them to share today as part of this, because a lot of the infrastructure, or most of all the infrastructure for Kilo, is managed by the community association, and I think it's safe to say a number of initiatives that have been done recently tie into this overall thing. So I want you guys go ahead and share.
Okay. Well, I'm Ryan Elmers. I'm the senior civil engineer with Kiwa Island Community Association. This is Matt Hill. He's our biologist. Our stuff really overlaps. Matt is the lakes supervisor for Kika. So oversees all of our lakes and our ponds. You want me to go first?
I can go first, that's fine. So this is just a satellite imagery of Kiowa Island. Put this up here to kind of show we're surrounded by water, of course. And if you look on the island, all of that blue is our network of ponds. We've got 122 ponds. It's a little more than that number, but 350 to 360 surface acres of water. Got about 50 miles of pond shoreline. There is, I don't even know how many miles of drainage infrastructure, meaning pipework that connects all these ponds together.
When we talk infrastructure, we're talking thousands of drainage inlets, pipes, outfall structures, pipe outfalls, BMPs, which would be riprap outfalls and stuff like that. I've been here 9 years, and I've never been able to completely
quantify all the stuff that we own and maintain. Which I want to touch on something that Chris said real quick. But most of this infrastructure it was designed based on the conditions that were present at the time. So if development on Kiowa started in the late 70s, somewhere through the 80s, at the time that it was being built, it was based on the information they had at hand. So today, what we do is try to manage a system based on a system previously designed, but now trying to manage it at today's conditions. Does that make sense? Right. Okay.
Does that mean it's not adequate? Is that?
It's not what I'm saying at all.
That's why
in some cases,
question.
in some cases, the infrastructure has to be updated or an upfit or has to be modified in order to account for today's conditions.
Okay.
such as Tide is a prime example.
Thank you.
Just, I'm sorry, I was stepped away, and if somebody already addressed this, apologies, but you said you manage 122 ponds. How many ponds are there on the island?
125.
Well, there's more than that. Kika does not manage the ocean course. Their pond system they handle that. It's not part of our drainage for the island. There's 1 or 2 ponds that have been added internal on the island when, let's say, Turtle Point Golf Course redesigns, they want to add a water feature. It gets tied into our drainage, but it sometimes does not get conveyed to us as a pond to manage. There's the pond there's a couple around Google Point, Bobcat Lane, I can't think of the.
Riverview
That's right, I know.
and the KIRE ponds are not part of
Yes, so there's there's more ponds on the island than what Kika manages, is the basis of what I'm trying to say. But the exact number of ponds, I've never counted all of them on a satellite map. I know it's more than 125. The majority is what we manage. Kind of segue into that, so if we look at this map, color-coded are our drainage basins. So we kind of say all ponds are connected, but they're kind of connected into these individual drainage basins. So got 15 drainage basins on the island. 7 of them are major, 8 minor. 2 basins. One is the Beachwalker outfall at Beachwalker Drive. The other is what we call a canvasback pond outfall. That's right near the second flyway drive and the second fire station. That area, there's a big, goes under Governor's Drive right there. Those 2 together drain about 70% of the island's water. So those 2 are obviously our most important basins. And of course, you can see with the color coding, there's others that are much smaller. And there's 10 weir structures. That's a engineered concrete structure that helps us kind of regulate water level. And Ryan, if you wanted to get into more on that, or if that covers it.
That kind of covers it. We're gonna kind of, one of the slides in here is a cross-sectional view of those structures, just to give you an idea. But I think the point of it is inside each one of those colored sections, that's where you just have so many inlets, so many pipes, all that stuff falls under, I'll say, jurisdiction to operate and maintain during your storm events.
Matt or Ryan, you mentioned 2 sites.
Green and purple.
Percentage of the, and when you say drain water or water draining, you're talking about off the roads into sewers?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, all of the stormwater, and to define stormwater for what we're talking about is the rainwater that hits the ground on Kiowa Island and gets flowed, however, by road, by a slope, into our pond system. The previous speaker came up with stormwater, and I think we're talking about tidal surge and mixing those 2 things. But when we're talking about stormwater, it's rainwater flowing into these ponds, and it includes the calculation of area where rainfall would hit over land, but ultimately is making its way into the ponds. If that answers, I might have got off track.
Well,
That
no,
answers your question.
Yeah, except that I'd like, if you can, give us an understanding of how much of the total rainwater that's coming into the island is not only captured by your entire system, but is drained into the ponds and through the system from that rainwater, as opposed to 70%. Is it 90? Is it 80?
I don't quite understand the
Either into
question.
ponds or through the pipes or the sewage or whatever.
Basically, anything that falls within those barriers somehow makes it into Kika's pond system and then ultimately out
Except for
the
the,
different outfalls.
including the stuff that's, as you mentioned, the resort areas that are drained?
Correct. I mean, pick at where the V gate is located, for example. Everything that falls around the V gate makes it into our storm system and ultimately makes its way through the ponds to Beachwalker Drive, to that outfall. Now, if you're looking for a quantity, like a volume of stormwater runoff, I don't have that information right in front of me. But of all the water that lands on Kiowa, 70% of it flows through 2 outfalls. One's by the fire station on Governor's and Flyway, and the other's at Beachwalker Drive. So just through controlling those 2 gates,
We can regulate how quickly or how slowly water runs off of those 2 basins.
You only have 2 outfalls for all of the major?
No, we have 7 major outfalls and 8 minor and countless direct discharge.
Well, that's what I thought, okay. So the minor outfalls, I'll look on your map when you're up, I guess, on Blue Heron or the ones that are far off the ocean front. Where are those, I'm just curious, where are those outfalls?
Believe there's not on this map, it could be the next slide, it's not the next slide, but, there's one coming up where I'll have some bullet points. It's actually in 2 slides, and you'll have that.
Okay, thanks.
And the major outfalls would be, the easiest way to classify them is they've got some sort of mechanical gate where we're able to raise and lower the pond.
Yes.
Ryan, how much maintenance is required to keep those drains working as well as you want them to be?
I've never had a dull day here on Kiowa. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Ryan, can I ask you just one quick question?
Okay.
The 15 outfalls,
Yes, ma'am.
when you all, pre-storm coming, when you all say that you're draining the ponds, are you essentially lifting up those gates and those 15?
Yes.
And to let the ponds drain? Is that what?
Yes, so there's
Okay,
interior and exterior gates, okay? And, well, Matt, I'll let you talk about
Yeah, I mean,
time regulation versus.
we've got a couple slides
That's fine.
coming up that I think will definitely answer that when we look at the, how it's functioning in the cross-section I was talking about. I think we're gonna get there in just a minute.
We'll get you there.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks.
In terms of how we maintain it, these are just some examples. This is a zoomed-in look at a portion of the island, particularly over by the Beach Walker system. We use Sanders Brothers a lot. So like prior to a storm event, if we know an event is coming, we usually have them out here cleaning out drains and lines where debris gets trapped. We try to, on a regular basis, inspect a lot of inlets in different problematic areas, particularly where we know a lot of construction is going on, because that's where you're going to get a lot more sediment buildup, say, in your inlets and in your pipes. So we try to keep an eye on those. But when I first got here in 2015, I don't know, we were budgeting probably around $300,000 annually to inspect and maintain our pipe system. We're well above that now. Here it is 2024 and we're at like $1 million mark. Okay, so we dedicate a lot of our resources and a lot of our money to making sure our system is functional and is being maintained. But that also includes like spot dredging our ponds. We've had it done twice now in the 5-year period, doing the bathymetry on our ponds to figure out where we've got major sediment build up around pipe ins, pipe inflows, pipe outflows, which all play a part in the functionality of our pond and pipe system. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I think here that we've probably covered this. The smallest picture, lower right, is, I believe that's the Beach Walker structure. So when we're talking about a weir structure, if you see there's a metal grate on the bottom, you can see kind of the stem. It's so small. Anyway, those are the gates that we manage. And then, Russ, you asked about, I don't know if this one's got like a, sure.
So little green.
Oh, here we go. So, Russ, you asked about the different locations. So everywhere you got like that little white dot is all of our major weir structures. I'm sorry. So like way over here is Beach Walker Drive, and then over here is Canvasback that we talked about. Which you got Iris Pond, Ingrid Pond. You mix it up in the preserves. It's kind of back off of their access room. It's shared by a property owner back here, but we have a gate back here, and this is kind of off of Snow Egret, and Iris Willet Ponds, Bass Pond. So that's a map of where all these actual concrete weirs are, and all along the back of the island, back over here, and over in this area, Ryan was talking about all of these just direct outflows into the marsh. There's, I don't even know how many of those.
Sea Marsh has got like 3 or 4. All those little thumbnails off of Sea Marsh, those are drop inlets that go right out to the marsh.
Got it.
They typically have some sort of old aluminum flap gate on them, which we have found over time, it's a pain in the butt to maintain, and over time they just become non-functional with the marsh grass, the mud, everything like that. So what we have done, and we get into it later on, but we're systematically putting in tide flex valves wherever possible, and trading out the old aluminum flap gates.
Makes sense.
To assist with the flood inundation or the tidal inundation.
So Matt, recently ran an article that talked about 2 of these sites having remote control so that you could, which are the 2 sites?
So it is the 2, the Canvasback and Beachwalker, the 2 that manage 70% of the water. It's those 2.
So when are those gates effectively closed when we're anticipating king tide and/or storm surge, so as to avoid any inundation coming back into the ponds?
Yes, some of the gates are. So these weir structures, and we'll get the cross-section in a minute, there's multiple gates and multiple flaps on these things. So, thank you, Ryan. Let's see here.
On the pond side of things, in this picture, which we right here, or sorry, the marsh side, this gate in this picture is showing that it's up. This clear area here would be the pipe flowing underneath the road.
If we had a storm coming, our first thing that we would do, or even sunny day, like just king tides, really high tides, we know that there's a level where we start to see water backfill onto some roads. And then we also know where there's a level where roads get breached, and that kind of ties into where there's a elevation issue where if storm surge water is higher than land, it doesn't really matter what the ponds do.
But we can close this gate
In all areas, and effectively keep high tide out of backflowing into the ponds. Now, it's not perfect. It's not a perfectly sealed system with rubber gaskets. A lot of these, like Ryan was saying, it's a cast iron flap that seals probably 95%, and through the tide cycle of high tide, you don't gain an appreciable amount of water into those ponds.
So I guess the question I've been struggling with on all of this is, if you do that, the water finds a way. Water, if it's coming onto the island, it wants to come onto the island. So you're saying, not going to be coming into the pipes, not going to be coming into the ponds, which may have been drained in anticipation of it. So it's just forced around the perimeter of the island where I'm posing the question, and I don't know quite how to articulate it, that would a strategy be to actually lower the ponds in advance and allow some of that inundation to come into the ponds and fill up the ponds, rather than being forced around the properties on the perimeter of the island, that are on the marshes?
So to easily answer that, the volume of water that our pond system can hold is not a drop in the bucket to the ocean, which is what's coming with a storm surge.
Okay.
So we can let water rush in, and I've always thought of it as you can dig a hole on the beach and watch just a regular wave kind of roll up the beach, fills that hole up, and it just keeps rolling. That's a storm surge with our pond system.
It's a real double-edged sword too, because so tropical storms, you have a problem with stormwater volume. Hurricanes, you got a problem with storm surge. So you drain all your ponds as a tropical storm approaches. Now it's changed from a tropical storm to a hurricane, and now you got to deal with storm surge. So take Rhett's Bluff Road, for example. Now you've got a major storm surge rushing over Rhett's Bluff Road into Bass Pond, because we dropped Bass Pond to handle some sort of stormwater volume. Rhett's Bluff Road is now gone because it washed out. So we're going to do the best we can with the information we get to create as much workable volume in our pond system as possible with the approaching storm. But I like the idea, but it's not, to Matt's point, it's not realistic, because you can't quantify how much water is going to come on this island. Does that make sense?
The event in December, there was both the pond side and the marsh side
Correct.
overflowed,
Correct.
and there was no storm surge then. Just a-
Yeah, that was a huge storm surge. December 17th last year?
We almost had a 10-foot tide.
tide.
9.86.
Fourth largest non-tropical tide ever.
What's the elevation?
It's like 8.7, 8.75.
So what was the question, Ryan? Would you ask him?
Well, there's a magic number that we're looking for in our tides where we know we're going to have some sort of breach at some spot on the island. And it's like 8.7, 8.75. So take Helene, for example. It got up to just about 9. We got just about a 9-foot tide. So we did have tidal inundation on the island in one spot. And once the high tide flipped, and this was just that high tide. Once the high tide flipped, it was gone in 30, 40 minutes.
How and where do you measure the high tides?
Sorry?
How and where do you measure the high tide mark?
So the town has that tide gauge on the bridge, and that's what we mostly use. And I guess the data input into that, you've got the predicted values from SCDNR and NOAA. So you've got a predicted tide value every day. Different environmental conditions, wind mainly, but moon phase, different things can make those tides run higher than the predicted value. So I don't have it with me, but you can look at that tide gauge and see the predicted value for Friday morning, 4 days ago? And at high tide, Friday morning at like 5 or 6 in the morning, we were 3.5 feet over that value because it will show you, overlay the actual value on the same graph. So it's pretty easy to be able to see the discrepancy.
This came out at one of our council meetings, and I can't remember if this was Coastal Sciences Engineering at the time was mentioning this fact, or was that somebody from NOAA? I can't remember that something's wrong with the predictive model because the observed tides are consistently now higher than the predicted tides.
That's right.
So something's amiss.
Well, what it forces us to do is always to act as if it's the worst case scenario. Because we can't necessarily trust the data, even though it's the best data we have that we're getting from meteorologists and everybody else. We're getting the same information everybody else is. So it's just always worst case scenario. Let's drain everything. Let's put pumps out. All these different things.
But I guess what I'm hearing is draining the ponds really only addresses a substantial rain event. It doesn't solve for sunny day tides or worse, a coastal storm where the winds are pushing water on shore.
Correct. That's one of the takeaways from this presentation at the end. I think there's a slide we say that essentially thinking about the pond system is rainfall. It is not designed to manage storm surge or high tides like that.
Yeah, if the river's coming in, it's going to fill up the pond in 1 minute.
And that's actually what happened in December.
Yeah, it is
The
exactly
river came in, filled up the ponds, and it was also raining. So it seemed like the ponds didn't hold the rainwater effectively, but the tides just filled them up with rainwater, or at the same time as rainwater. I guess if that answers the questions, we can really quickly, we kind of talked about it, but we've got,
In the previous slide that was up, this was kind of showing the same thing, this is canvas back, you're looking at something creeping into the pond across the others. This is a threaded rod, there's another here, we can turn these gates, and it essentially just raises and lowers them. I guess here's a better example of a wheel and smaller gate, but it's the same setup, and we can open or close those
depending on what we're trying to accomplish.
So it takes time to do that too, to spin those wheels and raise those gates. So going back to the automated system, at Beachwalker and at Canvasback, we're able to access it through an app. Basically, we contracted with an engineering company to design and build a computer program and a motor that we set on top of this thing, and from our office or from our house, we can log on and we can actually manipulate those gates at those locations during, before, after storm event. So that's the future. Those are, and there are kinks in that procedure that we have to deal with, internet, VPNs, all this different stuff. So we're working through those now so that it long term could be potentially implemented to all of our major outfall structures. Because the danger here with a lot of these is you have to be present on the island to manipulate them. So, and there's certain tide cycles that you want to have them raised or you want to have them lowered. So it's, yeah, it's complicated.
Do you have an estimate of the magnitude of a rain event that could be handled by the pond system without substantial rainwater flooding?
So
is it a foot of rain? Is it?
So Chris kind of touched on it in terms of design storm events, be it the 10, 25, 50, 100-year storms. We hired an outside engineering firm to do an analysis of our pond system and to essentially tell us when do we need to start draining ponds. I want to say it was right around a 25-year storm event we have to be draining ponds. They gave us an actual number or an actual volume that we have available in our pond system as a whole. Now, I will say that it's based on a lot of assumptions. It's based on the system being perfectly clean, there being no hiccups from start to, from up to down. So, and we understand that. So, it doesn't, I don't know that it really matters because even with it, that report was done 5-6 years ago, maybe. Even some of that data could be considered outdated because there's other things to consider, and that's like tailwater condition. That's your tide at the time that event occurs. The condition of your outfalls. We used that report back when they were doing the flood management committee. That kind of is how we backed into some of our flood management projects, which we're gonna talk about shortly. Does that kind of answer your question?
Just to make it clear, though, you're talking about a rain event versus a storm.
And we'll say it's the same.
Either one.
Either one.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a picture of that's the beach water. That's essentially what our automatic gates look like. And you can't see it, but back off to the right behind those pine trees is there's a control panel so that, let's say internet was down and we couldn't physically access it from our house, you can show up on site and go up and flip a switch or on a computer screen to raise and lower the gates.
Basically, we've kind of got storm operations, daily operations. This slide showing daily operations. We want a little bit of tidal transfer if we can get it. Not all high tides actually even come into our ponds. It's got to be at least about 6.1, but a little over 6 feet before it actually will come into our system.
And I guess the way we come in is if we're here in March, the flowing in, it's gonna fill this weir box and it's got a super level of this weir right here in order to flow in. So again,
Not all high tides are going to come in, but it's,
yeah, there it is. So that's what I was talking about. That's not there on kind of a
normal day-to-day basis when there's no king tides, no storms coming, anything like that.
That's what it looks like.
Yep, that's just water spilling over into the pond. And again, that's good for kind of the pond health, ecological health of the pond.
All right, as far as what we could handle.
Y'all have good questions. We're
way. So the outside engineering firm that we hired did the hydrologic study for us. Individual storms unique. So the big thing down here is under surge. Well,
touch on that in a second.
Yeah.
With the individual storms being unique, Brad, you asked about what is a number we can handle for rain. It's dependent on a lot of things. The rainfall we can handle at low tide versus the rainfall we can handle on a king tide is two totally different numbers. And that goes with a storm, like a named storm. they're not all the same. And so even though it's like, oh, well, it's another Category 1 hurricane, why did my house flood this time, or my yard, or the road, when it didn't last time? And it's really completely, no two storms are the same. The environmental conditions, the timing of tides, the timing of the storm impact with those tides, it's all pretty much unique for every storm.
I guess a different way to ask that, let's assume that you said it needed to be a 6.1 or something like that to actually result, a tide to result in inundation. So if you've lowered the storm in anticipation of, lowered the ponds in anticipation of a significant rain event, and there's not a tide that is predicted to be less than 6 feet.
Okay.
How much rainfall could the ponds then absorb? If you calculate that, is that part of the hydrologic study before you start getting spillover from the ponds? Because it's clearly, as soon as the rain event is done and you've got low tide, you can start pushing the water off the island.
Yes.
But wholly apart from that, if you're not getting inundation, there's got to be some amount of water you're anticipating the ponds to be able to rainfall that ponds able to absorb.
There is a volume that's calculated based on whatever the starting water surface elevation is, how far we were able to lower it. But there's a contributing factor in the intensity of the storm event, because you can have a volume of water hit in a 20-minute period that's equal to a volume of water that hits over an hour period. And you have two totally different reactions by the system under those conditions. So,
I mean, the ponds have capacity for rainfall at what we consider full pool, which would be even with the previous slide where you have the weir height. So at normal pond elevation, there is a bank, there is air between the pond elevation where it would spill over. So we can take fairly good amount of rainfall. I can't quite recall the exact number. It's somewhere around 4 to 6 inches of rain in a 24-hour period.
And that's without lowering the ponds.
Correct, that's without lowering. So if you lower ponds, it's obvious that it would be a product of how much you lower them by what you can take on.
When you lower the ponds, I read where it damages the health of the ponds. What causes that?
Well, I'll try to keep it to a very brief biology lesson when it comes to water quality and what's called limnology and the different layers of water. For the most part in ponds, you kind of have less oxygen the deeper you get. Our ponds, especially in the summertime when we're having heavier rainfall or this time of year, pond water is still pretty hot. Hot water holds less oxygen. So ponds are kind of already stressed in the summertime on a regular day. If you get heavy rainfall, let's say it's a thunderstorm, you got probably, 50, 60 degree rainwater hitting a 85 to 90 degree pond. Those two different waters have different densities based on salinity, based on temperature. You get rapid mixing is what I'm getting to. And that bottom layer of water will integrate with the top layers where it has a lot less oxygen, and ultimately it'll cause a fish kill. Less water in general, there's a carrying capacity per unit volume of water. Has X amount of oxygen per what temperature it is, it can hold X amount of fish that are trying to breathe. If we drain the ponds to half capacity, get ready for a big storm, you've got half as much water and the same number of fish essentially. That's a problem. So there's an erosion component to that that's not necessarily environmental, but every time you move water, it takes sediment with it. It doesn't matter if it's a tiny little wind ripple or if we drain 2 feet of water out of these ponds, it's going to take sediment. And so there's an erosion component to that as well. So I guess there's pros and cons to draining water. Yeah, we've kind of covered a lot of this. It's sort of showing, maybe the next slide or two is showing kind of how these structures are going to operate. I guess the best thing on this slide for you is, if we look at the top picture, and this is the pond side of the structure, we're looking at cross section. As the pond water rises, if it exceeds the top of this weir, it's just going to spill over and drain out. And this, of course, assuming we have a low enough tide, so anything less than 6 feet, we can start to drain. So I guess that'd be the big takeaway from that slide.
Yeah, also that the rainfall isn't consistent across the island. That's why you see different rainfall happening in Ocean Park as opposed to happening on Sea Marsh.
Okay. It's the tropical system. The difference here would be, you see that this flat is down, so we're going to keep the high tides coming in. And we can open this gate right here that allows water to drain out from the bottom. As we drain the water to be lower than at weir height, it's not going to spill over the top anymore. So that's how we're getting our drainage out. And again, we can't drain at high tide. Tide is not a light switch, right? We've all seen it. It slowly comes in, slowly goes out. It's about 6 hours and some change from low tide to high tide. So you have about 4 or 5 hours around low tide that you can actually drain, with dead low tide being the midpoint of that time frame. So it's not like if we say, oh, we're draining ponds, it takes a couple of days to get an appreciable amount of volume due to the 2 to 3 days really to get an appreciable capacity of drainage. Just because you're dealing with the tides, and essentially half of the time you can't drain water. And if you have excessive high tides because of the same storm you're draining for, it could actually limit your time even more, which is why most of the time we start these operations well in advance of a storm, multiple days to a week. And so we know we're going to limit high tides.
Yeah, this is a picture of some sunny days like.
Yeah, so this is a sunny day tide, and I'm not sure the height on that tide, but it's from the same spot. You can see there's kind of a bulkhead wall here, which was put in a long time ago, I think, due to high tides. I've been out here for 10 years, and it was long before my time, and I think that was to keep high tides from kind of coming into that area, not showing this kind of lower depression in the marsh. So that's kind of the industry. That's an example of a day where it didn't rain at all, and we took high tide. We were through. That would have been the only spot on the island where that happened.
John, did the materials include, I asked to have included the 2 slides from the Charleston Water study?
That I don't have that one in this presentation.
There were a couple slides, and maybe they can be circulated or posted elsewhere if anybody wants access to materials, but the Charleston Water Plan was released about a month ago, and then we also, a couple slides were interesting at a Johns Island Task Force meeting that showed predicted expected sea level rise, which is another foot next by 2050, 2040, or 2050, but also that of the highest tides, the vast majority of them have occurred in the last 10 years compared to the last previous 50. And so when you start saying 8.75 breaches, roads, and earthen dikes, we're going to have to learn to live with that, because that's going to start happening more frequently, wholly apart from storm surge, or is there anything we can do to address that?
It goes back to the elevation issue. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Ryan.
I mean, I can only speak for TK Infrastructure, but obviously if I go and I raise a road, it creates a cascading problem because everybody that accesses that road now has a drainage problem. It's not an easy answer, as I'm sure you're aware. This is the reason that resiliency departments are formed across municipalities, particularly on the coast, is to think about and deal with, plan for these types of problems. Now, we've been fortunate in that as of right now, we have a good idea, just based on the information available to us, where a lot of those trouble spots are, but long term, you're absolutely right. I don't think that the answer is as simple as, yeah, you're gonna have to deal with it. I don't know that that's an acceptable answer, you know? So, and I know I'm not answering your question.
There is no easy answer.
A couple locations, like near Pond 30, where
Right.
the parkway always flooded every single rainstorm by the fire station, every one. And he raised actually a wall there to protect the parkway. I'm
Yeah.
gonna say the word wrong.
So we took on, I'm gonna kind of fast forward to this, we took on flood mitigation projects, 6 of them in total. And we're in the process right now of doing our 6th one, which will wrap up that study. These were all points that had that problem that you're talking about, Mr. Bell. Every high tide, it was inundating the Parkway, Governor's Drive, the backside of neighborhoods. So we've systematically moved down Kiowa to try to prevent this from happening. All in hopes that during a major storm event, there's a way to get off the island if necessary, if needed. And like I said, we're doing number 6 right now, so.
Ryan, just quickly, looking at you guys' water management project, you guys are doing this systematically down the parkway to ultimately be able to get off the island. From you guys' kind of expertise or experience, is there something the town could be doing? Because if you get people to the gate, but you can't get them past the gate, so I don't know if there's something that you guys see that you say, well, maybe if we're able to do something to help. Is it crickets?
I've got ideas, but I don't.
Yes, and that's what this is
Go ahead.
all about, ideas.
Just a discussion.
I think it should have been handled when you did the Parkway. I mean, that was sarcastic, and I'm sorry. That intersection is complicated because, one, you have multiple turning movements, and multiple properties converging. So it's not a simple answer on, yeah, let's just raise the road. So I think something can be done. This past storm, Helene, I want to say that was one of the only places where I saw tidal inundation on that portion of the parkway. But it was essentially coming out of the storm drain box. So I don't know how to answer your question, Stephanie, but
No, that's all right. I mean, maybe there's not a good answer, as I'm thinking about it, is it that at that intersection, somehow, somewhere we acquire property where we turn it into a pond? I don't know what the answer,
Right.
could be from an engineering
the
standpoint.
biggest issue right there at the beginning in front of the gate is tidal inundation, not so much stormwater, trying to capture stormwater.
Okay.
It just sits really low right through that area. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Ryan, the 6 projects in the flood program all came from, essentially, it came from the marsh management plan that was produced. Do you, on a regular basis, Kika, on a regular basis, have a review done by experts that say these best practices are new, could be used, or just a review of the existing practices you do have to see if they need to be changed?
You mean as far as maintenance of the system or
Maintenance or-
operation?
Maintenance or upgrading or possibly even resiliency additions to the system?
So this was we'll call it phase 1 of flood mitigation projects. What we're in the process of doing now, and we've already done, we've identified the next 3 or 4. that we want to tackle next. So this is going to be an ongoing process moving forward to deal with the change of information, because we're in such a dynamic environment, to how to address these issues. Now, the plans for these obviously come with some sort of inherent maintenance program to make sure that it stays functional. So yes, we're checking it all the time to make sure tide flex valves are still operational, that we're not getting sediment buildup in these ponds, which cuts down on the volume. So there's all types of things we're doing on a regular basis to make sure these are being properly maintained. But as far as identifying more, that's ongoing.
So
Is that your question?
basically, you're saying the marsh management plan gives you the opportunity to consider changes down the road. How often or how far down the road would you need to revise that?
That's a good question. 3 to 5 years. I mean, that's, as far as me projecting out projects that I have in my department, it's a 3 to 5 year look ahead. 3 year, 5 years is obviously really way far out.
Mr. Spencer?
Two comments. If you're going to get to this later, that's fine. First of all, we live on inlet number 1. And it's called number 1 for a reason. It's right there at Beachwalker. And so we see the practical day-to-day of what they're describing, which, as you're raising, lowering the ponds. There's the last 300 feet to this problem. You touched on erosion a little bit, but when you're emptying the ponds, you could water ski on inlet number 1 because the flow is so strong. And I imagine that same effect happens on the marsh sides as well. So it's creating these channels as it goes through. So there is a potential erosion problem as we consider addressing more water and it going through. We're already seeing the erosion problem. I think it's Kika that put sandbags in on one side so far, which is helping with the erosion problem quite a bit. And it's got grass seeds in it. It's grown up really nice, and you can't see the sandbags anymore. But I think as we're thinking of the system, we need to make sure the system includes that last part that is outflowing. The second thing is, and Gene has seen this, last year Kika put in one-way valves in our street drains that went out in the inlet. World of difference. Basically, we were mini ponds on Sunlit Bend and Bellamy Hall, and that's what I've seen so far. That worked great, so that may be a solution that could be applied in other locations as well.
That was one of the first places that we've done it with direct discharge to the marsh. In Inlet Cove, you have drop inlets that go directly to the marsh. And they were having a problem with essentially every time you got a high tide, it's coming up out of the inlet and just flooding the roads. It's a simple enough solution, although a costly one, to install tide flex valves at all the outfalls. And all that does is essentially when high tide, it's got an internal valve to it so that high tide can't push up through the pipe. That's the nuts and bolts of it. So we installed 6 of them, 6, 7 of them, in Inlet Cove 1 and Inlet Cove 2 to stop that from happening. So.
You've done it in Reds Bluff
And we've done it in Reds Bluff too.
as well, because they have the same problem.
Right, and it's part of number 6, the flood mitigation number 6 project over.
Matt, before you wrap this up, I do have one comment, and that, number one, on management, I think you do more than an acceptable job. You do it much better in managing the overflow. The question has come up about quality, and I'm not sure what quality, I mean, we're not going to use it for drinking water, but what quality are we talking about, number one? And number two, what quality measures do you use in managing the drainage of the ponds, or what criteria do you use to maintain a quality level that you need to manage the water?
Okay. We just kind of on an annual basis contract with SCDNR, their algal ecology lab, and they're taking water samples and they give me feedback on abundance of algae, different species of algae. That's important. We've probably seen news articles, not recently, but from Florida, where they have these terrible fish kills due to these harmful algal blooms. There's certain species of algae that can either put off toxins or their structure can clog up the gills of fish. So we monitor that. That's one way we're monitoring water quality. We also, with SCDNR, the same, their algal ecology lab, we get fecal coliform levels tested. It might be quarterly, a couple times a year. I know after big storms, one that was really concerning was back in 2015. We had, I don't even remember how many inches of rain, but you know there's going to be a ton of runoff. And we had elevated levels, so I put out some warning statements back then. That's been almost 10 years now, but we do monitor that stuff. And also, they mentioned the Charleston Waterkeeper. There's a good resource. I don't know the exact website. I know it's not here, but you can see, sometimes it'll be in the Post and Courier when there is a bad issue. There's a lot of monitoring spots that people other than myself are going, and they're giving reports on fecal coliform specifically levels in our surrounding waters. And that gives kind of a good indication of what's going on just in the kind of greater Charleston waterway area. I monitor water quality in-house, got some equipment, and I'm looking at kind of basics of temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen content, things like that, to kind of understand the basic parameters for the health of the ponds. I would say we're fairly proactive. I don't know if that answers your question, or if there's, you want me to dive deeper into it?
It does with respect to the ponds, but what about water that flows out of the ponds or out of the drainage system into the marshes or into the river or the ocean?
Well, all right, I might not understand your question, but if we're testing the water that's in the ponds and that's the same water that's flowing out, then I'd say we're testing we know what's going on with the water that's flowing out.
Is it true that the fecal E. coli counts at the Kiowa Island Parkway Bridge going out to the ocean are high enough that you shouldn't eat any shellfish coming out of there? I've heard that from a couple of staff members with the Conservancy.
It varies. If you were to look at like the Charleston Waterkeeper stuff, fecal coliform levels vary daily, but certainly weekly, monthly, depending on storms. Kind of all over the Charleston area. I'll say there's been a lot of talk today about the Kiowa River and kind of surrounding areas like Johns Island flowing into that watershed. Kiowa River is fairly unique. It's a pretty short river, and you've got, if there's a map of the island, you've got an inlet on both sides. So if we get water that does have high levels, it is flushed very quickly. A comparison would be like the Edisto River, Ashley River, that comes from Ridgeville and is picking up, 30, 40, 50 miles worth of people's runoff. And the runoff we get from Johns Island, even though it is getting built up, is far more, I guess, natural than, let's say, runoff from downtown Charleston, if you could see where the difference would be there. So, in my opinion, the Kiowa River, Kiowa Island, and our marshes are extremely healthy in comparison to, and we have, I guess, documents of that from outside sources, but it's a very healthy system in comparison to kind of closer to the city of Charleston, if you will. Compare this to the harbor, let's just say.
Second part of my question, if you drop a pin in the middle of Kiowa Island, which is pretty much my house, and you take a 10-mile radius from there, the concentration of golf courses and more to be built, and the chemicals that are used to keep the golf courses so beautiful and playable, the runoff from those types of chemicals, does that cause a domino effect of algae blooms or other, toxic kind of reaction to those chemicals?
Algae blooms, certainly. There's going to be a lot of fertilizer runoff. That's what grows algae.
Right.
Is it always toxic, or is it even mostly toxic? No. I don't know when or what pesticides they may be using, if there's a fungus or, I don't know, mole crickets or something, that I don't know that, but there's certainly that sort of runoff that takes place.
Talk about your pond edges and why you like your pond edges the way you do with the grasses.
Okay, so Shannon brought up, y'all may be aware, we've been working maybe 5 or 6 years now on pretty massive amount of pruning around the pond edges on the island. I've been kind of working through the island. We talked earlier, there's a lot of ponds, a lot of miles of pond edges, but cutting back this really heavy vegetation that's woody stemmed, some of it's trees, a lot of it's wax myrtle, 30, 40 years old, coming back and replanting grasses. And what that does is the root system of a grass is a lot more capable of erosion control than, say, a big woody tree. And you think like, oh man, an oak tree's got these huge roots, that's great. Water actually channels down those root systems and creates erosion and undercutting of the bank. So we're trying to sort of take back the banks. When these grasses grow, you end up with this grassy buffer. Any stormwater pond management manual that you look at nowadays, it's pretty much best management practices to have a grassy buffer along the pond edge, 3 to 5 feet, I guess, thick or deep if you look at it that way. And that kind of slows runoff water. It's going to catch a lot of, litter, honestly, but it's going to capture a lot of stuff. It's going to lower the runoff rate, which will help with erosion control, and it allows that water to kind of soak in. It's somewhat similar to a rain garden is meant to slow down water runoff the rate at which it's moving. And we've been doing that around the island. I don't even know how many ponds we've hit at this point. It is a lot, though, and we're going to continue that for another couple of years.
So Matt, I have an important follow-up to the golf course question, 2 parts. One, does the golf course or the resort have to submit to KICA a list of what chemicals they're using, or pesticides or whatever they're using for the golf course? No. So they do what they want without any checks and balances?
I mean, there's the label of every chemical is federal law, so they don't just get to do whatever they want to do. There's
Talk about state licensing. You hold several state licenses.
right, so I guess finishing my thought. Any chemical you get there's a label, and it has an EPA registration number on it, and the label is the law. There's rates for usage, depending on maybe what you're spraying, how you're spraying. And that is, I guess, they come up with that rate based off of a lot of research. It takes a ton of research, millions of dollars, many years before you can get an approval for a product.
All right, so then I have a different follow-up then. So my original second part is not relevant anymore. So analogous to what we had here with the rodenticides and the coagulant problem with the rat poison that we're reusing, does KICA have a preferred fertilizer to use that would be the best out there to protect the integrity and health of our ponds? And then we need to make sure that that best chemical or fertilizer is being implemented and used, rather than just, because, this rodenticide was allowed to be used in the state. So somebody could be following the law and using something that we really don't want to use on this island. So how do we make sure that we're using the best fertilizer that's going to protect the health of the island's ecosystem?
I don't have an answer for that. You could say go natural and use chicken droppings, but that's going to put a lot of fecal coliform into the water.
Because I'm going to go back to the coagulant problem that we had. That was an allowed chemical, and it was a bad answer for us.
Yep.
So
I can tell you, Russ, we do, and always have since before my time, we do fish tissue sampling, where we send it off to a lab and we run a heavy metals and pesticide analysis on it, and we don't get back guess, bad reports, if that makes sense. So we do that because there's some people that like fish in our ponds, and some people even keep the fish and kill them.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And so we are looking for that. We've added the forever chemicals, the PFAOs and all that to that for this year, but we don't have that showing up in fish. There's certainly stuff in the water. I don't have an answer for you on regulating the resort and golf courses. I know that my staff, we're all licensed, Shannon hinted at that, through the state for commercial pesticide application. I know the golf courses, all those, not every employee, but the superintendents and the grounds guys, they're licensed or they operate under someone's license who is there at the course.
Well, my whole point is to stay in front of it, so we don't get into an analogous problem with fish being contaminated or turtles dying off or whatever the situation is, to be in front of it so we don't get into the problem that we have with the rats in the island.
Yeah, I mean, we test for it. I feel like we're in front of it.
Okay,
We're
all
already,
right.
we've been testing for it. I've probably got 25 years of
Okay.
fish samples.
Fair enough, fair enough. Thank you.
Maybe give space for one more question. Anything that you guys want to add, sort of what I would say maybe, I think you have your takeaway slides up there, but as after this workshop, things that you would potentially maybe recommend the town considering in next steps?
So one of the things I mentioned in conversations with Matrea is all of this is predicated on, all the stuff that we do is on Kika property. I don't have anything to do with private property owners. And the majority of phone calls we get after a storm event are a private property owner who said their yard is flooded. And there's nothing I can do to help them, other than advise them on people they can talk to off Kiowa. It sounds like the stormwater ordinance you're putting together is really designed to implement regulations and enforcement on those private property owners, on those home builders. Right? I mean, that's the way I understand it.
Talk about your drainage tie-in agreements, because you do have owners that do this.
Yeah, so anytime you're working on Kika property or within a Kika easement or right-of-way, you have to come through me to get an encroachment permit. There are requirements for how you're going to tie onto our system. What are you tying onto our system? Quantifying what you're putting into our system. But very rarely, in the grand scheme of things, do people come for that information to find out if they can tie onto Kika system. They're not installing drainage systems on their property, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and they're creating more problems.
So along that line, I was going to ask that question because I know that you guys can essentially deny, right, a system to tie into your system. So from kind of next step from the town's perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and you have to answer this now, is there anything that we can do from a regulatory standpoint that would make it so that if someone comes to you guys to tie in, it is like, yes, the town has put these regulations in place to make it better for you all to be able to tie, to allow that private developer owner to tie into your system because they've met regulations that we've put in place.
Yeah, so we encourage it if folks are able to do it. There's assumptions made in the original stormwater report for development of the island that a large majority of these properties would be flowing directly into Kika's system. So it's, in my opinion, we're already set up to handle it. It's more that people try to take advantage of it and actually try to tie on. It's as simple as a phone call. And sometimes, if we can't answer the question, we can point them in the right direction.
One follow-up to that, and you may have an answer, no. I don't know if Resort maybe want to speak to this as well. As part of the master plan for Kiowa, when Kiowa was developed, the golf courses were considered part of, or at least intent to be considered part of the drainage system. That's not actually in practice or in my mind as an application rather of is there any interaction between Kika, the resort, of accommodating the golf courses as part of the master drainage system for the island in general?
Sure. We have a lot of infrastructure running across the golf courses, and obviously, the majority of those ponds we do maintain. I don't know that I fully understand the question.
John?
Do we coordinate with,
So do we coordinate with the resort all the time? Every week, we're coordinating with the resort related to something. Is every pipe under a resort golf course ours? No. Some pipes only deal with draining golf courses. The pipes that Ryan is dealing with are draining common properties like roads. So those are our main drainage lines, and that's what he's dealing with. Every now and then, a project that he has runs into a problem related to a specific resort pipe. And then he'll get involved with the superintendent of the golf course and/or Brian Gerard to figure out how we deal with it. Is that your question?
From a storage capacity, is the you want to jump in?
Well, if I could just add to the statement and question, the original intent of certainly the three first golf courses, not the ocean course or the settlement, because they're in separate systems.
They're separate.
But the first three are part of that 70% world that you're talking about.
They are.
And there are select areas within those courses in terms of the profiles to receive extreme conditions. It wasn't like on a regular basis, but excessively extreme conditions where portions of the golf course would absorb it before it would go into residential areas. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that was the challenge for each of the golf course architects to account for, not a statistical number, but integrate it in such a way because they're all contiguous to the flow patterns. I mean, the golf courses and the drainage were part of a natural drainage system. So,
Any other?
Yeah, one final comment. I think you guys do and have historically done a terrific job with communicating the whole process and how it works. Remember vividly the Our World presentation that you did a couple of years ago. Just last week, I think you had the piece on how water drainage works. The one thing I had no idea about, this could just be me not having paid attention, but the fish kill situation and the levels of oxygen in the water, I didn't know anything about that. And I'm a golfer. When I'm out there and there are ponds that have got a lot of fish, it's a big question among an awful lot of people. So I think it might be a good opportunity for some additional communication.
Yeah, we talk about drainage a lot because we spend over $1 million a year of your money on drainage infrastructure. It's not sexy, you don't see it, but we want you to know what we're doing and why it's a benefit to you.
And it's there for anybody who wants it, which I really appreciate. But I would love another
Good
column
fish kill
that
article.
explains that.
Another great topic. Oh, that'd be awesome, Matt. You could have some smell factor to that.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Hey, inquiring minds.
We're transition to our next speaker. I was going to look at my clock. Does anyone need a break?
Yeah.
We could take a little 5-10 minute break. 5 minute break. Thank you.
I'm going to grab one.
Take my ball. Let's go ahead and get started. Put up a fight.
Really doesn't.
That's always a good idea.
Hey, Mark. Paul dropped me off. He's going up for it. That's all right. No,
Let us, who else we're missing? All right.
Be in control, John.
Next up, we have Lee Bundrick, Kiowa Conservancy. I know many of you already know Lee. Lee has been in a number of our conversations already, so he's very familiar, I think, of where we are. A lot of what he's provided ahead in your materials shows some data. And so, Lee, take it away.
And Lee, I hope you'll touch upon both water volume and water quality issues. So most of the first 2/3 of the discussion today was really dealing with water volume issues, managing that. We started to touch upon water quality issues in the more recent conversation, particularly runoffs from golf courses. But I hope you will certainly address water quality issues and why it's important for Kiowa to manage that as well.
Yes, absolutely. And, I kind of see that there was, a lot of things related to the basic science, like revolving around stormwater. I'll be touching on that today. I have a lot of cool animations to kind of keep everybody up and at 'em today. But today I'm going to be talking about stormwater as it kind of relates to impervious surfaces in particular. So I'm going into several different topics, and specifically going into the difference between natural conditions and developed conditions. Talking about some impervious surface data analysis, just for Kiowa, but in the entire region, kind of give you some examples how to compare Kiowa to other communities. We're going to be talking about water quality, how that kind of works into there, and we're going to have a general discussion about some alternative solutions to looking into stormwater mitigation. And for this one, we're going to be focusing mainly on pervious surfaces, but also touching on a few other ones that I'm happy to talk about. This is my favorite part. So I did create a few animations to kind of show you what it looks like between natural conditions versus developed conditions when you're looking at stormwater. And if you look at this as a natural condition, so just imagine a forest without any human interactions and everything. You have a groundwater table that's right underneath their feet. On Kiowa Island, it's about 2 to 3 foot underneath your foot at any time. And underneath there, you have a freshwater lens, and then and when you get closer to the marsh, it's a little bit more salty. But this is mainly recharged from the rain that actually flows down to the top. And 2-3 things happen right after that. You have infiltration that actually goes into the ground, recharges that groundwater, and then you have some surface water runoff. And generally in these areas, you have more infiltration going into the ground, recharging that groundwater, and you have less surface runoff. You can kind of see this is kind of acting like a sponge, a large sponge, kind of soaking in this water and releasing a little bit as it can't hold as much. And if you look at developed conditions, you have houses, buildings, roads, sidewalks, things of that nature. It sort of has a barrier to actually getting through into that sponge. So when you have rainfall that comes down, you're actually going to see it hit those surfaces and run right off those surfaces. This is that stormwater runoff. So in these instances, you're going to have more higher levels of runoff, and you're going to have lower levels of infiltration. So you have most of that going downstream, whether it be into the ponds and eventually to the marsh or directly into the marsh. You're going to have those different conditions. And generally, just to kind of summarize it, impervious surfaces prevent that stormwater from flowing into the ground. There's different types of impervious surfaces. Just imagine anything that won't let water go through it, and it has to run off to the side in order to get down in the ground. And these present different types of ecological stressors on the environment. Whether it be from the water quantity standpoint, which we talked about. So generally what you see is you have more stormwater flowing away from impervious surfaces than you do have in natural conditions. But you actually have degrading water quality conditions as well. So when we're talking about stormwater, we're not necessarily talking about quantity, but we're also talking about quality and how that impacts not only our way of life in Kiowa and in the greater region, but also how it affects generally wildlife that provide us those ecosystem services that make this place such a wonderful place to live. And generally I wanted to touch mainly on water quality. So for this, there's a lot of different types of water quality. You have things that
or that collect on these surfaces that eventually flow down. Eventually what happens is impervious surfaces, they collect stormwater runoff and these pollutants, and that stormwater runoff collects those pollutants and pushes it downstream. And that is going to lead to downstream impacts. Now there's different types of water quality pollutants, contaminants that are out there. Sometimes it'll flow into the pond system, it'll settle down, it'll remediate itself. But there's a lot of persistent contaminants that actually go through that system and can go through into the marsh. They're not easily broken down, they have a long half-life, and they just persist in the environment. You have a lot of these being remediated in the pond system, but there are still some water quality contaminants that do persist and they do go into the marsh. And there's quite a large variety of different types of contaminants, including things that we may not be aware of, like different types of soaps that can actually impact the survivability of fish downstream over time. But I won't go too far into that. I think what I want to do is kind of give a general kind of idea about what types of thresholds we should be looking at when it concerns to water quality impacts. We are lucky to have NOAA and DNR. They have an office nearby, and they've done a lot of really good research into this, looking at watersheds and how much impervious surfaces actually impact water quality. And generally what they found is, after studying this over the past 20 years, is that when you have impervious cover exceeding about 10 to 20%, you'll start to see adverse changes to the physical and chemical environment. And when you exceed 20 to 30%, you start to see significant changes that are often not easily reversible. And there's a lot of contaminants that they studied in this, and in particular they studied polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or petroleum products. They also had trace metals, heavy metals that were accumulating downstream, and also polybromated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants used in different types of materials for cars or furniture and things. So they found themselves downstream pretty easily. The EPA also has some impact thresholds, and I won't go over those too much, but they're included on the handout that you have in front of you. And with that 10 to 20 to 20 to 30% impervious surface is kind of the thresholds I was looking at in particular. And there was a big question about how much impervious surface do we have on Kiowa Island, and how do we compare to other communities within our region. I did some other analysis, but really I wanted to kind of get a regional basis first, and there's a lot of really good data out there. It's just about how to analyze it. So what I did is we created these different regions. We studied 20 different regions within the coastal area of South Carolina, with about 18 of those being in the Charleston region. And we studied the imperviousness of those regions. We kind of clipped out all of the wetland areas, and we only included the uplands. And we studied the percentage of impervious cover using NOAA CCAP data, which was released this past year. And with that, you'll see in table 1 is our analysis. So this is the percentage of impervious cover on the upland areas in these regions. And you see that Kiowa fits kind of within that median. We're right between Seabrook and Daniel Island, but it shows about 15.31%. You'll notice in the table and up here, it says it's unadjusted. And one of the reasons why is because this is a good indicator relatively about how much impervious cover we have, but it's not superiorly accurate. What you'll see is a map up here, and you'll see that everything in that like really bright white is considered impervious surfaces, and it's overlaid with a map from Google. But what you see is that it's missing a few spots here and there. It's missing driveways. It's missing most of the road cover. It's missing cart paths and things. So it doesn't really give us a good understanding of the total amount of impervious cover on the island. So that 15.3% is actually an underestimation of how much impervious cover we have. So we drew all of it out, which was really fun. We drew out all the buildings, all of the driveways, all the roads, you name it, we did it. And we were able to actually create land cover maps that actually help us to do not only study how much impervious cover we have on the island, but we can run some additional analysis based on green infrastructure and stuff that we're working on now. But this is accumulation of a lot of data, and it's summarized in the table. But if you look at Kiowa Island, we have about 3,725 acres of uplands, and about 18% of that is impervious cover. This is roughly equivalent to about 507 football fields. And over half of that is actually for transportation-related impervious cover. And, if we're looking at that, we see that the 10 to 20% range is what we're in right now. And we're kind of sitting at the 18% point. And, we don't necessarily have a solid understanding of how much, heavy metals we have in our system, how much PFASs, where there's been some studies. But, necessarily, this is kind of like a good example of where we're at comparatively to other communities, which we still need to do some more research about water quality that we actually are seeing in our rivers and what impairments we have. But one of the ways we can tell what the current impairments are within our system is actually looking at the shellfish management areas that are regulated by DNR and DES as part of state regulatory control. And we're currently within Shellfish Management Area 11, and they produced a report in 2023. And through this study, they basically do samples at varying locations where they do about 36 within a 3-year period. And they take measurements like this over time continuously to see what types of impairments we have in our watersheds. And right now, currently, we have fecal coliform impairments within our watershed. Some areas have dissolved oxygen issues, but there's a lot of turbidity in our water in certain areas. But generally, right now, what we're looking at is restrictions in the shellfish harvesting within our watershed because of what is stated in the report was bacteriological water quality is directly affected by non-point source pollution caused by development. So this is a map from DES showing the prohibited areas in brown, the restricted areas red, and the approved areas in gray. And each one of the different triangles you see up here is a testing spot that they continuously go to about 20 times a year and take samples from about 1 foot below the surface in order to understand what types of water quality impairments we have. So you can see in the Charleston Harbor, it's prohibited. There's a lot of, contaminants in those areas, but you can see that in the Kiowa and Seabrook area, we do have impairments on our own. And if you kind of zoom into this, you see that the western portion of the Kiowa River is currently restricted to shellfish harvesting. And you can see in the Bass and Center Creek areas, we actually do have shellfish harvesting restricted as well. And this comes from the water quality measurements being taken in there. And this is the latest map I could find as of September 18th, and I checked yesterday, and it's the same. So in concern with that, we're looking at issues with water quantity and water quality. And generally, there's a lot of different ways we can approach this, and Kika does a really good job of managing it with their stormwater system. But there's also this concern about the localized flooding, the issues with residential, commercial, whatever properties that are still accumulating these rainwaters and how to best manage those. And one of the things we worked on in early 2020, right before COVID hit, we started a project funded by the federal government to develop a nature-based solutions manual focused on trying to find alternative solutions with stormwater mitigation and marsh protection. And through a series of stakeholder engagement exercises and discussions with experts and scientists, we found about 13 practices and outlined them within this nature-based solutions manual. And if you look on the second page of that handout, you actually have a QR code that you can access that manual. And it basically highlights the different practices and highlights how you put them in, but also how do you maintain them and where are the best sites for them. But generally, we just wanted to provide this as like a blueprint for ideas and make this not only accessible to the experts who actually put these in, but also to the people who want to put these in, the landowners. And one of the things that's focused, and I've heard a lot about, is the pervious surface part in this. So, if we're looking at the impervious surfaces on the island that don't allow that infiltration in, we still need to use those for transportation or for walking, but we still need those hard surfaces, but there are pervious options that are available that allow that water to go through as if it was bare soil. So essentially what pervious surfaces are is a hardened structure that allows rainwater to collect on those surfaces and flow through into the underlying soils to allow it to infiltrate and to reduce runoff. So you're actually reducing runoff, but in the end, you're not carrying those pollutants away, and you're actually doing good for the water quality because you're not having those transportation of pollutants downstream. And there's different types of options. So you can use the concrete grid pavers, so the interlocking pavers you see at the Sandcastle, but you can also use porous concrete, or porous asphalt, or even some geogrids. There's a lot of different options available for having pervious surfaces that still allow for cars and such to drive over it, but allows for that water to go through. And we actually tested some of them. So there are quite a bit of examples already existing on Kiowa Island, as well as in Cacique, and we decided to test those. So we used a specific testing protocol, which is basically using an infiltrometer, basically a metal tube, dumping water into it, and then measuring how much time it takes for it to infiltrate. That's a very simple way of describing it. But we determined that most of what we see on the island exceeds the infiltration rate of most stormwater events. Now, maybe an engineer can probably help me out with that a little bit better, but the lowest we had was at Ocean Woods, which is 6.6 inches per hour, which most, I think, typically heavy rainfall events is probably about 2 to 3 inches per hour. So it could handle pretty well. But one of the things to really consider about this specific study was that we only studied the surface and not necessarily what's underneath. So while the infiltration going underneath was pretty fast, we actually have to consider what's underneath that surface that allows that water to go through faster. Soils do drain pretty fast, but they're sort of a determining factor for how fast that infiltration happens. So this is a map of Kiowa Island, and we mostly have hydrologic group A soils, which are high infiltration rates, low runoff, which is great. But they still don't infiltrate very fast. I mean, a typical rainfall event, you'll have 1 inch, which means you're still going to have quite a bit of runoff in those areas. And, you know, we really have to focus not only what's on the surface, but actually what's underneath and how that helps with reducing stormwater runoff. And this is why the anatomy of these pervious surfaces is so important. Now, when you have these surfaces, you're going to have it flow down, but you also need aggregate underneath to really support it. But that aggregate, that rock underneath, actually can serve as a reservoir to hold that water, to store it, to allow it to slowly permeate into the groundwater over time. So what you're doing is you're creating a pond underneath a driveway, I guess is the best way to put it, that slowly infiltrates over time. And it works in specific situations. Elevation and groundwater height is important. But generally, this is the best way to help with infiltration, is actually have some type of reservoir underneath that is with rock. So generally what you'll see is that in between those layers, you have geotextile fabrics that prevent those sediments, those fine sediments, from going through there and clogging up those pores. And generally, you have more pore space underneath to hold more water. So generally, it's basically another way to treat stormwater without it having flow downstream. And the one thing to consider is that, you know, I focused on pervious surfaces, and, you know, there is a variety of different options to use, and they don't have to be used alone. They can be used together in what we call stormwater treatment trains. So you can use things like rain barrels, porous surfaces, rain gardens, vegetated buffers, all work in the same way to reduce the amount of water quantity that's going downstream, to slow it down, but also to treat for water quality. So they all work together in some way or fashion. So sometimes there's not a one-goes-all approach. There could be several approaches that could work to help provide a solution for this. And in summary, you know, we have about 18% impervious cover, and with that we have water quality and water quantity concerns. We're still below the regional median, but, you know, I think that, you know, looking at our impervious surfaces and looking at reducing them will do a lot of good for reducing our stormwater mitigation, our stormwater impacts. So, you know, and I mentioned the 10 to 20 to 20 to 30% thresholds for ecological impacts. And to kind of put this into perspective, we have about 70 acres left of impervious surfaces before we reach that 20% threshold, where we're going to look at potentially seeing significant impacts into the ecological health of our river system. And in consideration for some different alternative practices, pervious surfaces are a great option. And the efficacy really depends on the design of those options. Now, you can have a pervious surface that looks great, but maybe it doesn't have something subsurface that makes it pretty much not effective. So having that 3D approach to understanding pervious surfaces is important. and they should be considered as part of a kind of a treatment train to help treat stormwater as it goes from one point of that point, that source of pollution all the way down to the downstream areas. And that's pretty much all I had, and I'm happy to answer any questions or go over anything else that's needed.
One thing, so the impervious materials is a great goal for me. I understand that you have a geotextile fabric that's going to prevent migration of fines down to the lower levels, which is the right answer. But at some point, given the sandy environment we're in, that geotextile fabric is going to build up and prevent water from going down. So the question is, there must be a maintenance program that has to prevent what I just discussed, the clogging of the geotextile fabric. So how long, what's the life expectancy before that happens?
So I think it typically depends on the area, especially if you have runoff coming from upland, like sedimented areas into there. It'll depend on how much time you would need to actually vacuum that out. The best way to prevent that system being clogged is to vacuum it out every 2 to 3 years, or every year is probably better. It really just depends on where it's located. And that'll prevent clogging in the system further. But I think if you do that pretty frequently, maintain that, it typically doesn't clog up as much.
All right, that's a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
You can also do that with proofing it, doing a kind of like a proof test by pouring water on it and seeing how long it takes the water to infiltrate when it's first installed, and then going back and doing it on a periodic basis.
When it's not draining, you know you got to clean it.
Correct, and then
Yeah.
sometimes the sweeper trucks or the vac trucks don't get it, so sometimes you have to use you have to be careful with this, but you can use a pressure washing and vac truck combo. There's a few of those around, and we'll go back and loosen up the material, and because the vac truck will remove some of the fines, but
Sure.
some of the stuff that's, if you go in every 2 years, some of that stuff that's 1 year and 10 months will start to get hardened, and it might not suck up as easily.
Right, I understand. So that's the answer I was looking for, so that's good. So it's been considered, and there's a way to maintain it relatively inexpensively.
And
It's got to get on a maintenance schedule.
Sure.
yeah, and I know that the Charleston County Stormwater Manual has some good options, some good ideas about stormwater maintenance. And in the Nature-Based Solutions Manual, we do have like a maintenance section about that too. That can provide some further information.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
When we were first talking about this in the meeting ago at the Planning Commission, one of the points that came up was that we needed a very, very good education program to get it out to the residents, because I think a lot of people, this change will be significant to them. And I think this is exactly this types of thing. If we go forward, if we do some text changes to our regulations, this is exactly the type of thing we need to take to the rest of the island.
Yeah, and we're glad to help out anyway to get this information out. Thank you.
To Larry's comment, I have a front yard that would be the perfect test case for a big rain garden, like 100 by. However, there are a lot of trees that are there because it was a section of my yard that was required to maintain trees, and we built 20 years ago. The lot was below street level, the whole lot, and it goes into a marsh behind me. So fill dirt was brought in, a big square in the middle of a square to build the house upon. So I have this depression off the street, then it comes back up again to the house, so it creates a pond when it rains. However, there's probably, 20 palm trees, 10 or 20 pine trees in the middle of that depression. To that point, it sounds to me like this should be added to designing with nature. Mark and Amanda sitting here next to me, this is a way to design with nature to help with problems brought on by excessive rainfall, at least on the street where I live. Most of the houses were built just like mine, just like I described. Fill dirt brought in, but not from the curb to the back of the lots.
Yeah.
So we all get ponds in the front. It's about a week. Most recent rainfall we had going back 10 days ago, it took 8 days for that pond in my front yard to finally subside. I had Collie Farah come out to my house, and Morgan, his new wife, to look at this area, and they're, oh yeah, but we gotta take these trees out. We can't do a rain garden in here without taking these trees out. There's too much coverage. Nothing's gonna grow underneath, all those trees. But anyway, the reason I mention that is, it seems to me like in the new world going forward, this should be this type of thinking should be incorporated into designing with nature.
Yes, and there is a link to this in the new revised version.
Great.
Yes, there is. And I think there has been some developments in, like Indigo Park is a good example where they put in pervious pavements as well as in several areas in Cassis. So I think that, I'm starting to see these practices more out, and I'm pretty sure the ARBs had to look at those. So, yeah.
Can a pervious driveway withstand the same amount of weight? Let's say I've got a 6,000-pound electric car coming in and out of my driveway. If I take out my existing concrete driveway and replace it with pervious pavers, can that withstand the same amount of weight and traffic back and forth over time as the concrete?
Yes, generally it can. A car it can. But
Not a Cybertruck. No, just kidding.
Sustainably.
so it really does depend on the construction and who's putting it in, what's underneath, what's actually supporting it. I think generally you would have to go to an engineer to ask that, but it has to do with not only the weight of the vehicle, but how often it's going through there. So it's different for a larger vehicle, different for a smaller one, so.
Question, is the diagram up here, is that the standard for impervious surfaces to have the layers like that? Because we're in the midst of a project now in my neighborhood, and I'm not sure the contractor's contemplating the multitude of layers that you have here.
I mean, it's an ideal situation, but I would imagine that most people would probably just put in a very dense layer of that large aggregate and then try to put stuff on top. I don't know if y'all have seen that anywhere.
So it's separated out like that to prevent the migration of the different particle sizes is what you want. You want to keep the open voids as much as possible. Let me break that down. So it's basically saying, like, you notice the stone is getting smaller and smaller as you go up. It's even called a choker course, so that it will choke the even finer sands from going through into
filters.
Fill it in the voids, which then clogs it up. So yes, that's ideal. In geotextile fabric, I could put 10 engineers in a room and get 10 different opinions about geotextile fabric. Woven, not woven, should we even put it or not, to that in situ soil layer is the argument.
So Charleston County regs get down into that level of detail regarding impervious surfaces?
If there's an engineer on the project, no, not typically, unless they're completely off in left field. If it's a mom and pop coming in for a residence and they want to do something permeable, of course, we'll jump in there and give them our opinion. We want them to build something that'll last.
But it's not a regulatory requirement.
Yes, sir.
And John, looking at, I know you've looked at other municipalities, a number have gone towards the regulatory mandate approach to impervious surfaces for new developments and any redevelopment of parking lots and driveways and the like. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at their regulatory regime, whether it gets into that level of detail or not, or it's just a broad pervious versus impervious.
And is it for commercial or large development as opposed to single family?
So we looked at a number of them, and they range in application type, whether it's single family, whether it's commercial. There are a number of them that have now just essentially required for all new development. There are some who just require a certain percentage of impervious cover. There is not a clear answer on to your other point of the sort of enforcement or looking back, defining.
I think, well, we used Charleston's County's definition for impervious, which I think was 0.01%, is that right?
0.3 inches per hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the.
That's just the infiltration rate is basically, that's all you're looking at.
I believe that 70% that you'd like to improve on the island is made up of what? Mostly parking lots, not roads, I assume?
Talking about the amount of impervious surfaces on the island, you're talking about this?
You say you want to improve it, reduce it to 20%?
I think that's what's left. That's the margin you got left until we cross the boundary.
The 70 acres.
So Yeah, so what you have here is basically the percentages on the right are just basically how much of that 100% impervious cover is the makeup of that. This was just a breakdown that we had from the shape files that we created.
Back to the slide where you had the 70 acres.
He just,
70 acres. Oh, okay, you're talking about the end. Okay.
I don't think there was a slide.
No, this was just, yeah.
Second point, what are we talking about, or where are we talking? 70 acres exist on the island.
So right now, we sit at 18% impervious cover, right? That's within that 10 to 20% threshold for impacts. If we look at 1% increase in impervious cover, that's 35 acres, roughly. If we increase to 70%, that's an extra 2%, which means it would reach that 20% threshold, which means we would reach into another threshold impact where we would see more concerning things occurring. And this is just based on what DNR NOAA had suggested. It's not a hard and fast number. There's no specific thresholds. There's different situations within each community, but it is a different thing to consider is that when we go and add 70% or 70 acres more of impervious cover, we are potentially going to see a proliferation of new impacts that we may not have seen before.
So, again, there's no specific areas that you have in mind?
No. This was just a general overview of impervious surfaces. Yes.
Andy, I want to let you know, so really is not, current technology is not good for roadways because a rolling load of a concrete truck, garbage truck, 18-wheeler, it will not hold up to it, or the rolling load will just destroy it.
So the targets would be driveways, parking lots?
Yes, yeah.
And are there things we can be doing on the future with the building cover as 30% of the impervious surface? Are there ways to better capture the stormwater off of buildings?
Yes, so there's several different ways. Now, you do have pervious cover, but you also have rain barrels, which actually collect those waters, and you can get them up to 3,000 gallons if you want to. It just depends on how much you're looking to collect and how much is actually coming off your roof. The other way is through things like rain gardens or bioswales, something that can be implemented on our property. It's usually involving some type of lowland area having a sandy soil mixture that allows for infiltration, and you can put all sorts of plants in there, and we recommend native plants. So.
Yeah, there was one illustration that we saw in the past about the volume of water that comes off the roofs. And it was really significant. But if you positioned some rain gardens, you could capture a lot of that water, so.
Yeah, and generally the kind of general rule is about 1,000 square foot of roof surface or any impervious surface releases about 628 gallons of water in a 1-inch rainfall event. So quite a lot of water.
Additional questions?
Mark?
Yeah, Lee, could you go back to the slide where I think you did the breakdown of different land use types?
That one.
I think
That
it
was
was
the
the
one
previous
before.
one.
You're talking about
That one, that's
okay.
right. 40%. So for the roads and parking would be understandable. For buildings and driveways, can you further break that down, attributed to the specific land use type? Like single-family development versus multifamily development?
I did not do that, a part of this, but it could be easily done if we look at some land cover map or land zoning maps. We could pretty much kind of calculate that, but we didn't do that for this one.
Because I think we'd all agree, in this room, I think we'd all agree the overwhelming land use type that impacts coverage is low-density residential single-family development, right?
Yeah, and I get
So that's the area, not the multifamily or non-residential types shouldn't address the better ways of thinking about the same category. But the area we could have the greatest impact would be single-family development.
And I guess you could potentially get a general idea of what Mark is talking about. So each one of the driveways is a single-family residential development. So, about eyeballing it, maybe 70% of that is, the building coverage is related to what you see in the driveways, so.
But I mean, if you were going to make an impact, you would have to have substantial change of the driveways. I mean, because obviously buildings, you're going to have the further development, so you'd have to probably get, a very high percentage of the driveways changed over to actually have an impact on that number.
Yeah, and, generally with ordinances, if we're to change, it would take years and years for it to accumulate to a point. But I think it's, as driveways get replaced, I mean, typically a driveway is 20, 30 years old before it needs to be replaced or considered for maintenance. You'll start to see that kind of trickle down and see replacement over time.
And there's 400 unbuilt lots on Kiowa as of now, according to Shannon, my source of information. So that is 400-ish new driveways to be built.
Yeah, but you're also talking about 400 on a building.
Yes.
So that's why I'm saying, you need to have a huge impact on driveways if you're going to have a positive change on that 18%.
We start to talk solutions.
I just think it's important that we look at all new construction. There are going to be more single-family than multifamily, but we have to look at all of them if we're going to stay below that number where it starts to impact the environment.
I think in some respects, you really want to try to accelerate the transformation. I mean, obviously, if we're going to wait 20 to 30 years for each driveway, that number is going to go from 18 to 20-some to or more.
There's a project that Gene's leading in our neighborhood, working with Sparrow Pond, to get a group of people to do it. And then there's price and value incentives to each homeowner to do it, brings the price down. I haven't seen the final prices, I don't know if you have them yet, but that might be a way to incentivize and accelerate.
I think the objective is to slow the pace of adding additional impervious surface, and then over time begin to reverse that to some extent.
Exactly.
And we need to educate. I mean, I was with someone who just replaced her driveway, and I said, "Did you go impervious? What's that?" So seriously, and so that's a driveway we lost that we could have had.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many others there are like that.
I think education and outreach generally is one of the best ways to get these new ideas out, and generally gets people interested in these new topics. There have been some people who come to me and like, I have this big driveway, what should I do? I'm like, just put in pea gravel. It's impervious and it looks nice, and you can pave it on, you can put bricks on the side, you can do different things. There's different options for it, so.
So, Lee, I want to put you on the spot. I know you weren't intending to talk about this, and you can demur if you would like to, but because this is the start of a broader discussion and dialogue about managing stormwater in all its forms, mitigating the negative impacts of that, and enhancing water quality. One of the projects that the Conservancy is exploring with the town is these wire basket oyster reefs, and there's been essentially a demonstration project at Mingo Point. Maybe you can touch upon that with this group as to kind of what the objectives are of that kind of initiative.
Yes, and those practices, they serve a lot of really good functions. So if we're looking at downstream water quality.
Is everybody aware of what this was done? Okay.
Generally, these manufactured wire reefs are pretty excellent ways of not only controlling erosion, but actually improving water quality over time. So there's sort of a nature-based solutions approach to build up oyster beds. And over time, we don't actually put live oysters on them, but they'll start to recruit over time. And as those oyster beds grow, give it 5-6 years, it'll be a natural oyster bed. It will be very dense. And oysters are natural filters, and essentially in a day's time, they can filter about 50 gallons of water. That's just one oyster. But when you multiply that over an entire reef, that's millions of gallons, and that will help mitigate the downstream water quality. And not only that, but it also serve as a wave break. So whenever we have any storm surges come in or any type of boat wave action, whatever, it'll all help to absorb some of that, that wave energy. It'll also provide a new habitat. And right behind these, the way they're set up is actually you have the building of sediment. You'll have the building of marshes behind it. So you're actually building marsh, you're building vegetation over time, and you're just pretty much just putting wire cages out in the marsh. It's pretty fascinating. Yeah.
So this is a project that the Conservancy has undertaken in partnership with the DNR. And they did installed, I don't know how many of these wire baskets at Mingo Point. And the question is, are there ways that we can take what was done there and do this elsewhere around the island? We're looking right now at Kiowa River Bridge, but the questions are, can we do this island-wide to further strengthen our marshes and enhance water quality?
Yes, and I think it depends on the capacity and where this is needed the most, and what situations is best for this. Because in some instances, you know, maybe a bulkhead is the right choice because of the infrastructure being impacted. But there are some places where these things can be implemented and help in situations where maybe there's a potential for erosion over time and you want to be proactive and prevent that. You could put those in those areas to prevent that marsh from eroding over time and impacting the uplands. There are, 100% plenty of areas within the Kiowa River we could do this, not only help for water quality, but help to build up the marsh over time. And there's this ever-growing feeling of sea level rise impacting our marshes as well. So that's something we're looking to as well.
Lee, given the dangers, if you will, of incursion into the freshwater areas of the marsh through whatever, whether it's overrun or whether it's storm damage, saltwater incursion, any damage there, and possibility of improving runoff from driveways, which would you rate as more of a priority?
I think in terms of the marsh, it's very resilient. I think that what we need to do is focus on the upstream areas and preventing our human influences from impacting the marsh. Because the marsh, it's fairly resilient if we give it time to live and breathe. But if we keep putting stressors on that environment, it will eventually be stressed too much and it can't come back. I think generally if we can prevent as much influence and impact into the marsh upstream, even before the ponds, then we can see that, you reduce the amount of effort you have to kind of cure something downstream. It's kind of one of those, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure sort of situations.
So you'd say the marsh is more of a priority?
I think the marsh is a priority, but what we do in the uplands is what we should be focused on. And basically any way we manage or do things in the uplands is going to impact what the situation is in the marsh.
No, I'm just suggesting it because of the marsh management plan points to the marsh as more of an important need, if you will, than the driveways or any other impervious surface.
No, the marsh management plan actually highlights that. So highlights that we should be looking at impervious surfaces on the highlands as
it should be from a freshwater standpoint, yes.
No, just in essentially regulating or managing our impervious amount percentage-wise. That's one of the recommendations that came out of the marsh management.
Also, John, with respect to the marsh, it talks clearly about the incursion of salt water into the marsh.
But I don't think it's a neither or, Andy. Why can't we do both?
You want to do both?
Why
That's 131 million New York spent. You want to spend it?
I think we've got it, I think we've got a dimension problem.
Yeah, it's a little small.
I do want to take advantage of having both planning commission and town council in the same room and just begin some dialogue before we close today. But before we do that, is anyone sitting sort of behind me in the public want to maybe share any comments generally before we have some general discussion? Anything that was stood out?
I've got a question, and this was very helpful, thanks. I think you mentioned, Mayor Bell, that it was the Charleston County Council, Jim, that certain communities have ordinances that are supposed to be neutral for developments to adjacent and adjoining properties. Did I understand that properly, that we're kind of an exception not having that as far as runoff?
I don't, I've got to be honest, John may have a better idea as to all the substantive differences that exist in Charleston County or other jurisdictions that have implemented stormwater management best practices. What we were advised by, and go back, and I know you've looked at the Weston and Sampson report that prepared for the town, identified, several, 8, 10, 12 different areas that they consider to be best practices that weren't required by the town's existing stormwater management ordinances, which only reference back to the DHEC, now DES guidelines, rather than the more rigorous standards or regulations that other jurisdictions, such as Charleston County, have implemented.
Yeah, so to that, that's one of the things that was built into the initial, what I'm calling our stormwater supplemental standards that many other communities have already adopted. And what that does is allow that community to be a little bit more closer to as the local municipality, but just be a little bit more closer in review and in application of how stormwater is managed from a best management practice standpoint. And so I think what staff is requesting today from our fearless leaders in the room and thought leaders and expertise in the room is begin to have a conversation of what is the best mechanism, what's the best strategy for Kiowa in all of these different considerations. So I want to just kind of begin, and you all have already received some recommendations. We won't have to go through all of those, redline those, but I think just from a general standpoint, want to get your thoughts and have somewhat of a dialogue before we break today. The subcommittee of the marsh management work group put together the pervious impervious that has went through planning commission, pervious paving requirements that's went through planning commission, that's now sort of sitting with town council. And so we've begin to outline a path forward for discussions around what might be some supplemental standards that we can add in. What I wrote down today in all of the conversation and dialogue is the uniqueness of Kiowa and what might be some of those things that we are already having discussion with, pond edges, specific data requirements around whether or not we utilize 25-year, 1,000-year in our analysis. But what I want to do is just open it up to you guys to begin. What are your thoughts so far? And that way we can have some guidance as next steps.
So John, I have one, it's a follow-up question, but it's a suggestion as well. The very first slide that we had that you spoke of, you referenced the 2018 mitigation and sea level rise project. You indicated in that there were 130 items that were recommended. All right, so we start with that. I don't know what of those were discussed here. I suspect probably not any. But somebody already went through some brain exercise and came up with 130 of those. What would you say are the top 3 of that list?
So we've actually internally begin to already assess those recommendations and kind of what I would call prioritizing based on the immediate need, not need, but what things can be done in a short term, near term, and things that may take 4 or 5 years or better. That particular document, the first thing initially was for us to look at our marsh because that was identified as the biggest risk. So I think if you, from a long-term standpoint, us addressing critical areas along the marsh edge, what can we do to protect, to ensure that that stays in its state form now, to be able to recover areas of risk or areas of harm?
So that's a great start. That's a great recommendation. I like that a lot. Only because I don't have that document. I could work with you or come up, determine together with you of that 130 items, which ones really float to the top.
Yeah.
So we can
And it's
get a
not
copy
all,
of that.
the uniqueness about that document, it's not all town dependent, and so some of those things have already been implemented by the community association in their infrastructure projects, and so it's sort of a collaborative effort. I've worked previously with Lucas Hernandez, and during the time of him being with Kika, during that drafting of that and sort of looking at those steps. But when the Planning Commission with the town adopted our resiliency elements in the 2019 and utilized the marsh management plan as that platform, that's the birth of these, that was sort of the origin or birth of these particular recommendations of pervious surfaces.
All right. So in addition to whatever's going to come up after I finish this discussion with you, let me get a copy of that and we'll work together, and then you and I can talk with others subsequently, like in a week or so.
Russ, not to overcome that, but that was the reason I asked the question of Lee, to prioritize issues, those two
Sure.
I mentioned. Sure. We're talking about the whole thing, and not to tell tales out of school, but I was at this meeting when we first decided what the marsh management subcommittees would look like and what they would address. And it was clear from the direction we got that we were looking for low-hanging fruit, something they could solve quickly, maybe not costly, but show some progress. There's no question of prioritization. It should have been, but there wasn't. And the fact was, they decided on some issues that may not be that significant in terms of what's being done and what's being accomplished on the island, to go ahead and do those rather than some of the more important ones and some of the more impactful ones.
All right, well, it's 6 years subsequent, so maybe, we look at it again and some great, euphoric moments will come from that.
I agree.
So it's just a good starting point. It's 130 items. There's got to be 2 or 3 that are good.
It might take a few days.
That's okay.
I personally, in all of this, think that education is going to be such a critical part. And we have so many new owners. You go back 6 years, we have so many new owners. There's so much turnover. And so many people are probably not even familiar with that report from 6 years ago.
I know.
And I think it would be great, too, if there were 130 items and some have already been implemented. We should be highlight what's been done so far and how much more needs to be done. But, we can talk about all of this, but, as Joanne said, her neighbor does a driveway and is not aware of any of it, and it sort of defeats the purpose. If we can just really, just constantly communicate with people, eventually.
Yeah, I agree. You're right. Yeah.
Let me jump on the bandwagon and say, when we first got this at the Planning Commission, I felt just completely overwhelmed. It was such a, there were things I never even thought about. I think that, so I don't want to start with a clean sheet of paper. I think using what was already been done as a starting point, I think makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Any other comments?
Are there any questions or comments relatively to those existing frameworks or anything that was presented today that influences your thought pattern of what you've already seen regarding pervious pavements, pervious paving requirements, or supplementary standards, that things that we should be considering?
I think we really should push the pervious driveways. If Joanne has one example, somebody doesn't know of it, there's got to be many others. And to make it well known, that's an option that would be acceptable. Maybe we can figure out a way to give them a credit. I don't know, there's no taxes that we give a credit on, but to give them an incentive to use that kind of program.
What we talked about in the strategic planning meeting was going beyond that we discussed whether incentive program would work, but the other approach, which is I think reflected in the draft ordinance that's being worked on now, is simply mandating, which is the direction many other coastal communities have gone.
Yeah.
I think isn't this the incentive? The 2% more.
That is the new proposed new incentive. So if you all recall, the strategic plan we presented from the marsh management group, sort of an incentive-wise approach, sort of dual prong, looking at both a carrot and stick. And today, where we are is that carrot and stick approach. The stick, if you will, has been advanced a little bit further. It has not stopped the work group from still considering additional incentives. We're still studying that. But I think what you have in your materials regarding requirements of pervious elements on site development for new developments, that's where we are today.
There was something else that came up in our planning commission, talked about the quality of runoff. We were talking about building sites. You see a lot in the single-family homes where there's materials that really shouldn't be run off into the environment, but are during the rain. And we talked, I don't know.
That came up before you were here.
Sorry.
There was
I was not in here.
No, we don't have that.
Okay. And what about also holding, in addition to?
That was going to be my next. So
Holding on.
on-site retention was the other big concept that was discussed with the Planning Commission. Essentially, we're requiring a on-site retention for impervious coverage that was modeled, that was referenced earlier, right? But the proposed development would need to retain a certain amount of on-site before it enters the master drainage system. And so before Kika's even, it enters Kika's system, some of that water would be retained on site. And so that's one of the things that is part of this recommendation that staff has supported, is looking at some elements, some variables, whether or not, and that it depends on site size, it depends on the mechanism, whether it's a rain barrel, whether it's on-site detention, all those different things. But that is one of the elements that I think could be formidable for FUA.
All right, so another suggestion then, John. Gay talked about her property. I also have a swale that I inherited on my property, which takes forever to drain, but it's an on-site retention basin. Could new development or new housing, you don't have to put a retention pond in, but provide a low-lying area where a certain amount of water, I'm not talking anything monstrous and obnoxious and super aggressive, but you can still always have a low-lying area created to store a certain amount of water.
You can do it under yards too. That was the
Yeah,
regulation
exactly.
in our previous town. You had to do a retention thing on your yard.
Well, I'm trying not to be too aggressive, although I like the idea, I just don't want to be.
Actually, Russ, a lot of the properties, and I think ARB would support this, the drainage plan, if you will, for the site, is generally to have all the runoff into the property.
Yes.
Not to go out, except for the occasional one, maybe off
Yes.
the driveway or whatever. So if it goes into the property, you could use that, you could use a rain garden, you could use a number of things to deal with it. But I think pretty much all the properties initially are designed that way. What happens afterwards, and people change it, or some construction comes in or whatever, you can't answer that, but I think the fact is, a lot of it's been that way and it's worked. There's very little runoff from properties to the streets.
Well, I do know some friends of ours that have complained that neighbors to them built a new house that's more elevated.
That's different.
And they get all of their runoff.
Yeah, that downstream,
Yeah.
Yeah, and that shouldn't be,
No, you're right.
I know our old regulations, you couldn't do
So,
that.
so then, actually, what I just said, so a house being elevated, that's creating a runoff problem to, I mean, somehow that, we have to think about how to address that.
That happened when the flood line changed.
Yeah, the elevations.
So I don't know the answer to that, but that's, we do need to address that somehow.
I'll give you some history sometime.
Okay.
Any other points before we? Final comments or any thoughts, or?
I thank the speakers. I think that everyone did a wonderful job and gave us a lot more insight into this topic, so we certainly appreciate you coming in. The residents, thank you for coming in and supporting this group and your questions. Very helpful.
Mr. Chairman, well said.
No.
Be continued.
Well, that adjourns
So-
our day. Oh,
And just, what's the status of this? We discussed this at the July meeting. I think
Right.
we voted to approve it, didn't we?
so it has, that did receive planning commission recommendation. So at this time, it's sitting with town council. After this workshop today, we'll have some better guidance from council on whether or not that formalizes to an agenda item for further consideration.
Because this was the initial, just the initial phase.
Right.
Yeah.
And to Dr. Kern, to that point, on Wednesday, Planning Commission, we have on our agenda item to further discuss this. So there'll be a little bit more time for you guys to discuss what might be the next steps and all of the things, but short of what Russell just shared as well.
There was a lot of material that was presented today, but there was no advanced material for the session. Would we have access to?
We will have those online today.
Okay,
We'll
good.
see the slides a little late, but we'll
Great.
have those
That's
online
great.
available.
So I'd like to throw in my thanks to John, who has kind of brought together today an awful lot of issues that have been peripherally discussed by all of our different environmental subcommittees, and a lot of the kinds of things that we've been talking about from an island resiliency perspective now for the last couple of years. And I think an effort like this to tie a lot of it together, to bring it to the attention of the public, to give it that, another shot at the educational/informational element of this entire initiative. Kudos. I'm glad. I don't know that it accomplished everything that you were hoping it would. I think it accomplished a lot, and I think it serves as a good template for moving forward, for bringing this kind of topic, comprehensive topic together. So thank you.
Well, we stand adjourned, I guess.
Good job.
Thank you all.
Thank you.